He said that if you love someone, let them go.
He had the perm, he had hip-hop, bravado, but also his own set of weird idiosyncrasies that made him stand out.
If they come back again, they're yours to keep.
She made this huge commitment by leaving her life behind and coming to New York. The lustful relationship that they had, it was exciting. It was moving really quickly.
But what if you aren't the only lover they've lured in?
She was hurt, she was heartbroken, but she also felt like, you know what? I just have to do something else to get his attention.
And the sting of jealousy is so severe, you could kill.
Just imagine how police have now potentially encountered somebody who may be a danger to people.
They see a person lying face down on the ground with blood coming from his head. His whole life flashed before his eyes, and he just threw up right there on the scene.
September 22nd, 2006, Fort Lee, New Jersey. It's a chilly Friday night in this commuter neighborhood just outside of New York City.
Fort Lee, New Jersey. It's at the foot of the George Washington Bridge, and it has a lot of restaurants. It has a lot of local spas and eateries for people to just enjoy themselves when they're coming home from work or if they want to hang out on the weekend. And it's literally right there, beautiful views across the Hudson River, looking at New York City.
It is generally a safe place with a very effective police department. But like any community, it has the proximity and the opportunity where somebody who wants to do something bad can find the place to do it.
At approximately 4:40 p.m., the Fort Lee Police Department receives a panicked call from the front desk attendant.
A desk person who's working wee hours of the morning calls the 911 to the Fort Lee Police to say that there's been a shooting.
They're doing their regular shift, and all of a sudden, this man comes downstairs saying to call 911 because someone got shot in room 408.
But before the front desk clerk could gather any more details, the man took off.
The front desk clerk assumed the person ran back up to that room. In his frantic mode, he left the tape on the front desk counter.
The clerk says that he was hesitant to follow him, but he didn't feel much safer in the lobby of the hotel either.
Possible person who was either involved in it or is a victim of the shooting is still in the facility because the front desk clerk said nobody left through the front door.
The 911 operator tells the clerk to stay put and wait for the police because they are on the way.
The Fort Lee Police Department is approximately 3/4 of a mile or a mile away from this location. I dare say they were there very, very quickly.
The police are trying to keep the clerk calm. They ask him if he can tell them anything about the man that's staying in room 408.
The clerk says all he knows is that the room is registered to a man named Alan Plowden. Alan Plowden and David Taylor, both Florida natives, carved a complex mortgage and mail fraud scheme, manipulated the financial system to siphon off massive sums of money, crafting a life of luxury from ill-gotten gains.
So David and Alan knew each other going back for many years. They lived in and scammed people in Miami and Atlanta.
David and Alan's criminal partnership spanned many years, thriving in the shadows in the vibrant scenes of Miami and Atlanta, where they perfected their craft and deception and lived off the riches of their elaborate schemes. Their operation amassed a fortune, peaking with a staggering $1.4 million from a single fraudulent transaction.
David was in New York with bags of money, literally, and he was looking to have that type of lifestyle in the New York City scene.
As the cash flowed, their descent into the criminal abyss deepened, setting the stage for a tragic chain of events. The moment they arrive, Fort Lee police head straight for Alan Plowden's room, number 408, but not without putting a careful plan in play first.
The officers are walking into this scene as if there is an active shooter on site. So they have their guns drawn already, and they're making their way up to the 4th floor.
They get to the 4th floor without a problem, but as soon as they were approaching room 408, they were surprised by a man who was running out the room shirtless.
Rather than the person come towards them, he runs and goes back into a room. Police have now potentially encountered somebody who may be a danger to people in the hotel, to the police, to people who otherwise might be in the room. They're on high alert.
So now they're bringing out more tactic equipment, the shields, the battering ram, and they're making their way closer to that front door. And when they get there, they're trying to talk to the people who are on the other side, but they really couldn't make out who was speaking towards them.
Officers place a call to room 408. To their surprise, a woman answers the phone.
She identifies herself as Jennifer Nettles, and at that point, police are thinking this might be a hostage situation.
She's mentioned that somebody has been shot. She mentions the word gun. Police at that point don't know if the gunman or the gun person is in the room, don't know if there's a gun, and don't know if she herself is in some sort of jeopardy.
Eventually, she explains that it's herself in the room, the gentleman that the officer saw go back inside the room, Alan Plowden, and then there's a person who was shot that's on the floor, David Taylor, who's friends with Alan Plowden.
Now, of course, hearing that somebody is injured inside the room, police are hoping that they can get in there and, do something to save this individual. But in order to do that, they have to get inside the room.
Police have to make instant judgments as to what they do. Are they walking into a trap, or in fact, are they going in to relieve and help people who otherwise might be victims of a crime?
Fort Lee police have been called to a local Holiday Inn, where a man has reportedly been shot inside room 408. But with no idea where the gunman could be now, officers must handle the situation with extreme caution.
So their first concern is safety. Okay. Are they themselves safe? They know there's been some sort of a shooting. They want to make sure that they themselves are not walking into a trap.
Although Jennifer is telling the negotiator that the people in the room are who they are, the officers really truly don't know if this is true.
They also have a duty. And if somebody is shot inside the room, they're going to need medical attention. And with an injury like that, every second counts.
So they're talking to her and they're explaining to her to relay information to Alan for him to step out. And as soon as he steps out, he had a backpack on his back and wearing shorts. The officers then handcuffed him, put him on the ground. They check him for any weapons that are possibly on him.
And it seems that his appearance in that less than full garb can assure them that he doesn't have a gun in a pocket and a jacket in some way secreted from them.
Still, he does have a backpack. When police search the bag, they don't find a weapon, but potentially a motive. It's a scenario that would certainly make sense, given the hotel's location.
Between here and the George Washington Bridge into Upper Manhattan and to further up through New England is a major drug corridor. To the George Washington Bridge, probably the most traveled bridge in the United States. Several different roadways, including Route 95, the main corridor between north and south in the United States along the eastern seaboard, and Route 80, which basically starts a mile or two from here, will take you all the way to California. That proximity is good for tourists, but it also gives access to those who think ill, who can use these locations for criminality. Lo and behold, the mystery continues by opening the bag, and now you find $30,000. It's not what's usually in a person's backpack. It's cash, it's a big amount. There must be a drug deal that has had to have gone on or didn't go on or went bad.
But if this was a drug deal gone wrong, police are left wondering what the woman, Jennifer, had to do with it.
Jennifer comes out and she only has her underwear on.
The obvious might be that there might be some trade that has been going on in that particular, whether simply for frivolity, for fun, or for money.
The officers check her, obviously, for any other types of weapons, and they also handcuff her as well.
Alan and Jennifer are transported to a police cruiser downstairs to await further questioning. Meanwhile, police go searching for their room's third occupant, the shooting victim, David Taylor.
Officers then enter in the hotel room in room 408. and they see a person lying face down on the ground with blood coming from his head.
Clearly, when they see the individual, while they're sympathetic and hopeful that the person may still be able to be rendered medical attention, it becomes clear from the blood, from the failure to move, from a touch, that the person has been shot and killed.
The room itself looked like it was ransacked, like there might have been some type of scuffle. The sheets are out of place. The mattress is flipped over. There's a shirt that's torn apart. There was just clearly something that happened here prior to the shooting.
The man doesn't have any ID on him. He appears to be wearing pajamas, but what he does have on him is a key card to a room on the second floor.
They find out that David was actually also a guest in the hotel as well and was staying on the second floor. So the officers go down to the second floor hotel room.
They go in a room, they find a startled young lady wondering what has occurred. Here comes the next puzzle piece. What is she doing in the room?
The woman's name is Mercedes Cantu. She tells police she was called up earlier that night by the shooting victim, David Taylor, who was visiting from Miami for the week.
While David was up here in New York, David had called Mercedes to hang out, go shopping, to just chill. And he told Mercedes that he had a friend in town, Alan Plowden, and he wanted to know if she had any friends for the both of them to hang out with. Mercedes then told David about her friend Jennifer Nettles. They both were sex workers.
There was a night of enjoyment, entertainment.
As the night goes on, they go to their own separate quarters. They have hotel rooms set up for them, David on the second floor, Alan on the fourth floor.
But not long after Mercedes and David got back to the room, David gets a text message, and he tells Mercedes that he has to, go check on something in room 408. That was the last time that Mercedes saw David.
Police bring Jennifer Nettles and Alan Plowden into the station for questioning.
Police have to find out what's going on. They have to be able to speak to people who will provide them information, both as evidence and a lead to where the suspect or suspects may in fact be.
They are really honing in on Jennifer's account because she was in the room where David was shot.
What they'll do is, of course, they'll separate the people so you can get their whole version of what happened.
Jennifer's story starts off a lot like Mercedes' story. They were headed out for a night on the town, and then when they came back to the hotel, they each went off to their own rooms.
Jennifer says that after they were in the hotel room and they were sleeping, Alan gets 2 phone calls.
That's when the night took a dangerous turn.
She gets up to go to the bathroom. It's the middle of the night, and there's a knock on the door. When she goes to answer the door, there's a man and a woman on the other side.
The unexpected visitors tell Jennifer they're there to see a man named Jay. Convinced they have the wrong room, Jennifer tries to close the door.
The woman on the other side puts her foot in the middle of the door to prevent it from closing, and then the gentleman on the other side has a handgun that's pointing in her face.
You see this instrument of death right in front of you. So now, what might have been the uncertainty or surprise that somebody's got a foot in their door has now quadrupled in terms of fear factor.
So she lets the door open, and as they walk inside, Jennifer gets shoved into the bathroom with that woman. And that woman starts to duct tape her mouth, her hands. She bounds her to keep quiet, and she threatens her before leaving the bathroom and going into the room itself. All she can hear on the other side of the door is scuffling and noise and rustling, and Jennifer starts to take note of the tone of voices that she's hearing through the walls, and it seemed like the woman knew Alan.
Fort Lee police are meeting with Jennifer Nettles, a witness to the hotel shooting of David Taylor. Jennifer claims she was trapped and bound with duct tape in the bathroom of his friend Alan's hotel room after the 2 suspects barged in.
Can you imagine the fear in Jennifer? Now, she's just listening to what's going on. Alan is in the middle of it with a gun in his face.
And then a gun goes off. And people leave the hotel room. What Jennifer's hearing through the wall is not exactly going to help in the investigation. They want to hear more of what happened when they interacted with Alan.
Across the hall, police sit down with the second hotel witness, Alan Plowden.
Alan tells investigators that he was sleeping while Jennifer was in the bathroom and all the other commotion was going on.
When he finally does wake up, Alan confirms Jennifer's hunch. He hears the voice of a woman that he recognizes.
He recognizes this voice, somebody he has had a relationship with, who he has spent time with, and who he has spoken to. It's somebody he knows as Gina Conway.
Gina Conway was a 29-year-old exotic dancer who grew up in North Carolina's Piedmont region.
She also had ties in Baltimore County, Maryland. Her mom lived in Baltimore, remarried, and her family was still living in North Carolina. So she went back and forth a lot between those two cities. In the early 2000s, Gina would mostly spend her time in North Carolina, not only because of family, but she had a boyfriend of 10 years that still lived back home. So she was really there a lot. And during that time, hip-hop was coming through with some new flavor, and she was into, and so was her boyfriend, a group called Dipset.
Dipset, which the sort of core group is Cameron, Jim Jones, Joel Santana, and then, you have a lot of other Hell Rel, J.R. Writer, Freaky Zeke.
And there was a lot of people that was in this crew that they were able to make a lot of hit records that are still known to this day.
When Gina learned that Dipset was coming through town, she jumped at the chance to get concert tickets with her boyfriend. After the show, she managed to get them invited backstage.
Gina's that kind of person that she doesn't have a hard time getting along with people. She has that charisma. She's able to talk her way into any kind of door. So while Gina was backstage with her boyfriend, she happens to meet one of those entourage members, Charlie Wingate, aka Max Bigavelli, aka Max B.
Max B had that same mix of sort of classic New York hip hop, bravado, but also his own set of weird idiosyncrasies that made him stand out. He had the perm, he had sort of straight up R&B songs. He's a charming guy. Every project he's released in his career has at least a few love songs. He's always talked about sort of emotional vulnerability being the hallmark of the music he makes, and a lot of that is very flirtatious and romantic.
Max B giving her any type of attention really did intrigue her to the point where she might have forgot she was there with her boyfriend. After the concert, Max B and Gina exchanged phone numbers.
After weeks of exchanging texts and calls, Gina was finally ready to ditch her life in North Carolina for a future with this alluring new man.
So Gina comes up to New York, and she's living with Charlie in his apartment. He's in the studio, he's doing shows at night, he's touring, and Gina's working as an exotic dancer at the Sin City nightclub. The lustful relationship that Gina and Max had, it was exciting. It was moving really quickly.
But a relationship with the rising hip-hop artist also came with a lot of heartache.
2 months after Max and Gina realize that this relationship isn't working and Gina moves back home, Max starts blowing her phone up. Baby, come back kind of conversations.
She came back to New York, and there was some controversy around his having impregnated a woman.
Obviously, Gina's gonna be pissed. Why are you wooing me? Why are you trying to make me feel like I'm the only woman when you have a whole situation and a whole baby on the way? So while Gina's trying to figure out everything, thankfully, she gets her job back at Sin City. She was hurt, she was heartbroken, but she also felt like, you know what? If he cared about me enough to bring me back here after I left already, then I just have to do something else to get his attention. Days prior to the robbery, she saw David and she saw Alan at the club and hung out with them, and they wanted to hang out with her because she just had a way with them.
In the last few days, Alan and David had enjoyed several more outings with Gina.
They went out after that first meetup and hung out where they went shopping at a mall in Bergen County, bought a lot of expensive stuff. And she had a great time with them, and they had a great time with her. And they wanted to hang out with her even more times after that.
But never would Alan have thought the next time he saw Gina, she'd be robbing him.
Alan tells investigators he's thinking he might be dreaming because he's hearing Gina's voice in this hotel room. But when he opens his eyes, he has a gun in his face. And a man who's holding the gun, he doesn't recognize him, but he also notices that the gunman has this scar on his cheek. The guy with the gun is asking him, where's the money at? And he's like, what money? He gets hit in the face. Gina's starting to tie him up with the tape that she used to tie up Jennifer, puts the duct tape around his face, his mouth, his eyes, his hands, and they keep asking him, where's the money? He tells them that he has $700 underneath the mattress. So they flip the mattress and they're still telling him that where's the rest of the money?
It's a dynamic situation. And what must be going through his head is he's trying to figure out, somebody knows there's money here. Who would know?
Based on what Alan is telling law enforcement, he had all the money that he knew these robbers were looking for, but Alan knew that he needed to hide his valuables even before this whole situation happened because he has a strange woman in his room.
Still, Alan knew that these robbers weren't leaving until they got what they wanted. So he told them that the money was hidden away in his friend's room.
So the gunman tells him, call your friend.
He gets on the phone with David, who's on the second floor, and tells David in a weird way that he is in trouble, but he needs him to come upstairs.
David coming upstairs may just simply think that it's a physical confrontation, fist on fist, mano a mano. You don't bring fists to a gunfight. And what happens is he now is confronted by and sees the presence of a gun.
And as soon as the door opens, the gunman and David, they start to scuffle. Alan is laying on the ground. He tells investigators that his friend David and this gunman scuffle and his friend gets shot in the head. The guy and Gina are grabbing whatever that they can find in the room, and then they leave the hotel room. Alan tells investigators that after the gunman and Gina left the hotel room, he goes to Jennifer in the bathroom to get her out of her own restraints.
Alan then ran downstairs to try to catch Gina and her accomplice before they could get away.
But he actually catches up with Gina, and he hits her. She somehow gets away from him and darts out of the hotel. The guy she came with was already in the taxi cab, and they took off.
Gina knows that Alan can recognize her from the crime scene, so she probably wants to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. So now you have a suspect on the run and no idea how to...
The survivor of a Fort Lee hotel robbery turned murder has just identified a viable suspect in the case. But so far, police have no leads on where 29-year-old Gina Conway could have fled from there.
As investigators are trying to figure out where's Gina, who she was with in this cab, developments start to come in.
Hotels were among the first places to really have cameras because they have to protect themselves from their own liability. Stuff happening at a hotel.
They weren't everywhere as you see it these days. So the police were able to at least get the license plate and the cab numbers that were called to chauffeur Gina and whoever else around that night. And they were able to track down the cab driver.
Investigators asked the cab driver what he remembers from the night he drove Gina and her companion to the hotel.
You find the cab driver. You find the cab driver's location. You find the log that he might have. And with that, now you've got names.
The driver tells them that he picked up Kelvin Learnham, and that person told him where to go. It was different locations. They stopped at a gas station and ended up at different Holiday Inn locations until they found the right one on Route 4.
He says that when they finally got to the right hotel, they asked him to wait for them. And Gina said, they'd only be a few minutes.
The cabbie said that he wound up waiting about an hour, and when they emerged from the hotel, the guy had changed his clothes, and they were both carrying bags. The man gave him an address back in Harlem, and that's where he dropped both of the passengers off.
So now investigators have Gina Conway And they have Kelvin Leardom, who are the two people inside the taxi cab that was driving around.
But when police trace the Harlem address back to a public basketball court, it seems like a dead end. Until they realize the address is just blocks from another location that's come up in their investigation.
Police then start doing more investigating, and they find the Sin City address to where Gina was working.
Police drop in on the club where Alan Plowden told them he met Gina just a few days earlier. It's there they uncover another valuable clue.
Now, police are looking through her records from the club, and they find that she's listed an unknown address as her place of residence. This isn't the hotel address, it isn't a family address. I mean, it's not even her ex-boyfriend Max B's address. But it does turn out to be the address of a coworker, Turon Golston.
According to co-workers, Turon is a bouncer for the club. Gina saw him like a big brother, someone she could confide in, someone who would protect her.
Police immediately head for Turon's address with a warrant in hand. But when they arrive, there's no sign of Gina, but there's plenty more of interest.
They found a lot of things that were taken out of the hotel. They found Alan's cell phone inside of Turon's apartment, so they got a subpoena for that.
The police also find Alan's clothes and laptop in Turon's apartment.
Can you imagine the surprise when Mr. Golston is told by the police that evidence taken from the scene of a murder is now found in his house, that he seemingly had nothing to do with? Of course, he's going to say where he got it. Gina brought it over to him.
Turon doesn't seem to have any information about the items that are in his house. And he's missing one key piece of evidence attributed to the shooter, a scar on his cheek. It was clear that Gina had been here recently. Now police just needed to wait for her to come back.
Fort Lee police are hot on the trail of a suspect in the shooting death of David Taylor inside a local hotel. But 6 days after the crime, Gina Conway and her accomplice remain in the wind.
They're looking for her because now we have a suspect on the loose, if you will.
Law enforcement can get a communications data warrant to pinpoint where somebody might have been at a given hour at a given time. So, for example, if the phone pings for a location in Fort Lee at 4 o'clock in the morning on the date in question, you got the phone there.
Armed with Gina's phone number from her personnel file, police are able to trace her mobile device to a location in Harlem.
And they do pick her up not too far away at a subway station in Harlem.
She was living life on the run for a period of time. Life on the run because she was either witness or participating in something serious or something that she might have thought was far different than what she had originally planned to do.
But by the time police bring her back to the station, Gina is ready to come clean.
She gets into the precinct, and investigators are kind of shocked because she's just willing to tell them anything. She didn't ask for a lawyer, and she just starts talking.
Gina tells police that it all started when she found out her boyfriend was having a baby with another woman.
It's one of those things that you're like, okay, I'm here. What do I need to do to make sure that he knows that I should be the only person he's focusing all his time and energy on? And Gina is just in fight or flight mode. She's just trying to figure it out while also her feelings are hurt.
So I think it's logical that she maybe wanted to make him a little bit jealous.
As the investigators are talking to Gina, she tells them she told her boyfriend Max B about the shopping spree that she went on with David and Alan. She was bragging to Max to make him jealous, to show that other men are showing her attention. Two big ballers who are taking her shopping. She thought this was going to entice him to say, let me step up and be a better boyfriend to her.
It has an opposite effect. He sees it potentially as opportunity. We'll go get him. We'll see if we can make a fast rip, get the money from what sounds to me that Wingate thought was an easy mark.
The jealous boyfriend, Max B, is coming up with this whole plan to rob these two dudes who just took his girlfriend out and showed her a good time. And at that moment, Gina doesn't stop him from this plan, according to what she's telling the investigators. She kind of leans into it like, wow, he's including me in something that we can do together.
With Max B's encouragement, Gina makes a date with David and Alan on the morning of September 22nd.
They had a fun outing, but David and Alan had to cut things short with Gina because they were getting ready to hang out with Jennifer and Mercedes. So as she prepared to head out, Gina asked to borrow Alan's room key to use the restroom before she left. Then she walked out of the hotel without returning the key.
Gina tells investigators that they all met at the park to really plot out this plan. It was herself, Max B, as well as Kelvin, his stepbrother. Gina had that room key to get access to Alan's room where the money, she believed, was. And she also knew that Alan was going to be out with David at a nightclub with these two young ladies. So if once they get in the room, they can clean it up, get out. They won't even know it was Gina or anybody involved with getting into their room. And as they're being sent off that night in the taxi cab that Max calls to have this whole thing happen, he tells Gina in a reassuring manner that if you do this, you're my girl, you're the one. Almost like a proposal in some kind of way. And she knew she had to make this plan work in order for her to get that goal.
But when they arrive that night, Gina says things didn't go according to plan.
When Gina got to the hotel, she went to room 408 and the room key didn't work. Unbeknownst to her, Alan had to change in the room keys earlier that day because it just didn't work for him. So she decided to knock at the door, and that's when Jennifer answered.
She starts to tell that, in fact, what she thought that there would be a ripoff of these people now evolved into something far, far more dangerous.
Up until that point, Gina's feeling kind of angsty because they're not finding the right hotel, the room key isn't working, and as that's happening, she sees that Kelvin has a gun and duct tape on him. It's not a part of the plan.
Kelvin holds the gun up to Alan's head and demands the money. That's when Alan offers them the $700 hidden under his mattress.
Gina's aware that he has a suitcase or a book bag that he walks around with a lot of money. And he's still saying, I don't have the money, but then he says that his friend downstairs has it.
By this point, they had already come too far, and Gina felt like she couldn't back down. She tried to focus on the plan of getting the room key from David so that they can go down to the second floor to get the money. But then the shot was fired as she watched her new friend David fall dead to the ground. They ran, headed for the second floor as fast as they could, but they did not count on Alan breaking free and running after them. As he followed them into the hall, they had no choice but to abort the mission.
Gina tells investigators that she took the $700 over to Charlie's sister-in-law's house, and while they were there, he had promised her that he would take care of her and that he was sorry about what happened.
As police sit across from the tearful suspect, they can see that Gina is sorry too. Nevertheless, on this day, Gina was charged with manslaughter.
That's when police offered Gina a deal. Turn in your accomplices and we'll make things easier for you. But Gina had already done so much for Max B. Was she really capable of turning against him and his stepbrother?
Gina Conway has just confessed to her part in the robbery and murder of David Taylor inside a Fort Lee hotel room. Now, police are eager to get her boyfriend Max B and his stepbrother, Kelvin Leerdam, also behind bars.
They subpoena everybody's cell phone that they had a suspicion of being a part of this crime, Kelvin's especially as well. And so at that point, the police are putting two and two together. Cell phone towers are pinging. It shows that Gina, Kelvin, and Max and the taxi cab driver were at that gas station at the time that she said they were. And it also shows that Alan, Gina, were at the hotel with Kelvin all at the same time when the robbery did occur.
Coupled with Alan Plowden's statement about the shooter having a scar, police are able to arrest Kelvin Leerdam.
Police then apprehend Charlie Wingate, and he is charged with murder. And when they talk to him, he's not giving them anything. He's tight-lipped, doesn't even say that he knows anybody involved in this case.
Without anything directly tying Max B to the crime scene, police know his conviction hinges on Gina's cooperation.
It's a homicide, it's a robbery, it's a felony murder. Those type of ties, once you are acting in concert, you can equally get the same amount as somebody who pulled the trigger. Kelvin and Max B were facing life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Cooperators, people who are involved in the crime, who ultimately agree to testify on behalf of the state. The strength or the weakness of that witness is often measured. Gina's story matched Plowden's story, matched Jennifer's story, without them being any connection really between them that would lend to them telling and making up a story together.
Because Gina was able to dime out her boyfriend and Kelvin, who was the shooter in this whole entire case, she was able to negotiate a lesser sentence of only 15 years flat.
On June 9, 2009, Max B. and Kelvin Leerdam are found guilty of felony murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy.
They were convicted of each and every one of the crimes, which included weapons, which included a kidnapping that they or coercion that they held them in. A judge could very well, and did in this set of circumstances, sentence them consistent with their roles. Gina was a facilitator. Wingate was the mastermind, but the greatest damage was done by the shooter.
Kelvin received a maximum life sentence, and Max B was sentenced to a very extensive sentence of over 50 years.
Almost immediately, the verdict against Max B ignites an uproar in the hip-hop community.
People are looking at it as, oh, this man's entire life. So that naturally sent shockwaves within hip-hop. There was also a perception that the severity of his sentence was not, to some people, reflective of his level of involvement in the crime in question.
There's this whole Free Max B movement that has percolated after he was sentenced, and it's continued throughout the years.
The movement has led to moderate successes.
Kelvin tried his attempt to get a reduced sentence. That didn't work. Gina tried to get her sentence reduced, even though she already had a negotiated plea. That was rejected as well. Max B was the only person whose post-conviction review ended where there was a reduced sentence.
Max B gets his conviction lowered to 20 years. He is set to be released in 2025.
When he got his sentence reduced, hip-hop fans of his and others felt there's going to be a future of Max B to come as soon as he gets out.
He's released music through a few different sort of smaller independent labels. He doesn't talk a ton about exactly how he records the music, the new music. There's lots of rappers who, while incarcerated, have recorded songs over a phone in prison, and it's not clear if that's what Max is doing. He doesn't really address the case that explicitly. He's done a lot of love songs. He's maintained his innocence, maintained sort of a positive outlook on, when I get out, things are going to be great.
Gina thought that he really wanted to be with her, but his intentions, as she saw that first day, were not genuine. I wish that Gina packed her bags and went back home to where her family was and try to win back that gentleman that was with her for 10 years so that she could have had a different outcome at life. Unfortunately, she wasted 15 years behind bars because of a man that she thought was for her, and she did all this for her man that was not ever really her man.
A firm grasp is good when you're climbing a mountain or shaking hands with a stranger. But trying to hold on to a love that is slipping away will only send you both crashing over the edge.
On a freezing, snow-swept November night in 1994, the vibrant, multicultural metropolis of Toronto was struck by a chilling crime that would haunt the city's consciousness for over 3 decades. It began in a quiet, residential enclave in Scarborough, where suburban tranquility was shattered in a single, silent instant. 19-year-old university student Elena Vance walked off her evening shift at a local community library, stepping into the biting Canadian winter wind, carrying her canvas backpack and an umbrella against the light flurries dusting the asphalt. She was only 6 blocks from her family's front porch, a walk she had taken hundreds of times without fear. But that night, Elena never made it home. By midnight, when her frantic parents called the Metropolitan Toronto Police Service, the initial response was routine, treating it as a possible delayed return or a miscommunication between young adults. But within 24 hours, as her abandoned winter coat and shattered eyeglasses were discovered half-buried in a snowdrift near an industrial ravine access road, the tone shifted instantly from a missing person welfare check to a full-scale, high-priority homicide investigation. The crime scene at the edge of the Rouge River Ravine presented an agonizing nightmare for investigators. The bitter cold and heavy snowfall had already begun to obscure physical evidence, creating a race against time and nature. Forensics teams swept the area under towering mobile floodlights, their breaths freezing in the night air as they combed through frozen brush and ice-crusted mud. Elena's body was found several hundred yards down an unpaved service track, hidden beneath discarded industrial debris and fresh snow. The cause of death was immediately evident as severe blunt force trauma coupled with asphyxiation. The brutality of the attack stood in stark, terrifying contrast to Elena's gentle life, a dedicated biology student, a church volunteer, and a beloved daughter with no known enemies or risky habits. The realization that a violent predator was hunting in the quiet suburbs sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, prompting parents to pull their children indoors and turning once welcoming residential streets into landscapes of intense anxiety and mistrust. In the days and weeks that followed, the Toronto Homicide Unit launched one of the most exhaustive dragnets in the department's history. Detectives interviewed hundreds of residents, canvassed transit routes, checked local gas stations, and cataloged dozens of potential suspect leads. Every man who had been seen near the library or along Elena's walk home was systematically questioned, alibied, and evaluated. Yet, despite the massive expenditure of police resources, the investigation hit a series of frustrating brick walls. The physical evidence collected from Elena's clothing and the crime scene, including trace amounts of male biological material recovered beneath her fingernails and on her garments, was painstakingly preserved, but the DNA profiling technology of 1994 was far too rudimentary to yield a definitive match. The national DNA offender databases were still in their infancy, lacking the massive reference networks needed to identify an unknown perpetrator without a direct suspect comparison. As months bled into years, the tragic case of Elena Vance slowly drifted from the front-page headlines of the Toronto Star into the somber, dust-laden shelves of the cold case unit. The vibrant teenager's photograph remained pinned to the corkboard inside the homicide division, a constant, painful reminder of a promise unfulfilled and a killer walking free. Over the next 30 years, multiple lead investigators took the helm of File 94 to 88,210, each bringing fresh eyes and renewed determination, only to reach the same agonizing dead end. Suspect after suspect was ruled out through traditional elimination testing, leaving Elena's grieving family to navigate decades of unimaginable sorrow, trapped in a permanent state of unresolved grief. The case seemed destined to remain one of Toronto's most haunting, unsolved mysteries, a dark shadow cast over the city's history that time appeared powerless to erase. Then came the scientific revolution that would completely overturn 30 years of forensic stagnation. By the mid-2020s, the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy, a groundbreaking convergence of advanced genomic sequencing and public genealogical databases, offered cold case detectives an unprecedented tool to shatter long-standing deadlocks. In early 2025, Toronto police cold case detectives, working in close collaboration with elite forensic geneticists, submitted the microscale biological sample recovered from Elena's garments in 1994 for whole genome sequencing. Rather than searching for a direct one-to-one match in restricted criminal databases, the advanced algorithms mapped millions of single nucleotide polymorphisms, building a detailed genetic blueprint that was cross-referenced against public family tree databases. Within weeks, the algorithm flagged distant genetic cousins, allowing expert genealogists to construct a massive, multi-generational family tree that converged on a single-family branch residing in the Greater Toronto Area during the mid-1990s. The breakthrough led investigators down a narrow, chilling path toward an individual who had never once appeared on the original 1994 suspect boards. Through meticulous archival research, birth records, property deeds, and employment logs, detectives narrowed the focus onto a 62-year-old retired civil engineer living a quiet, unassuming life in a manicured neighborhood in Mississauga. He was a respected community member, a father, and an active volunteer with local sports leagues, a man who had spent 3 decades living just 30 kilometers from the scene of the horrific crime. A discreet, round-the-clock surveillance operation was launched to obtain a discarded reference DNA sample. When plainclothes officers recovered a discarded coffee cup from a public trash receptacle, the laboratory performed an urgent high-stringency comparison. The result was instantaneous and absolute, a multi-locus match with an error probability of less than 1 in 1 trillion. The dynamic arrest that followed sent shockwaves through the province of Ontario. Tactical teams moved in on a crisp Tuesday morning, taking the suspect into custody without incident as he walked to his vehicle in his driveway. The contrast between the mundane suburban morning and the terrifying reality of the allegations was stark and surreal. For the Vance family, who had endured 31 long years of suffocating silence and agonizing doubt, the sudden phone call from the lead detective brought an overwhelming torrent of emotion, a mixture of profound relief, renewed grief, and the surreal realization that the phantom who had haunted their lives for 3 decades finally had a name and a face. As news of the chilling arrest broke across international news networks, the Toronto 1994 cold case was transformed overnight from a tragic symbol of failure into a historic triumph of modern science over human deception. The immediate aftermath of the arrest sparked an intense re-examination of the suspect's entire adult life. Homicide detectives and behavioral analysts quickly realized that a predator capable of committing such a violent, cold-blooded act in 1994 was unlikely to have lived a completely blameless existence before or after that fate-filled night. A multi-jurisdictional task force was immediately established, working in coordination with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Provincial Police Services to systematically audit every unresolved missing persons report, unsolved assault, and cold case murder across Ontario and Quebec spanning from 1980 to 2010. Investigators began sifting through decades of travel logs, former addresses, vehicle registrations, and employment records, determined to uncover whether Elena Vance was an isolated victim of opportunity or the tragic centerpiece of a far broader, covert pattern of violent predation. Inside the interrogation rooms at Toronto Police Headquarters, the mood was tense, heavy, and meticulously controlled. Experienced interrogators spent hours confronting the suspect with the unyielding reality of the forensic evidence, peeling back the layers of a carefully constructed 30-year lie. Outside the station, media crews and local residents gathered in the cold, holding candlelight vigils and seeking answers to the terrifying question that hung over the entire city. How could a man accused of such monstrous violence live completely unnoticed among his peers, building a seemingly wholesome life while carrying the darkest of secrets? The resolution of the Elena Vance case stood not only as an extraordinary forensic achievement, but as a chilling reminder that the monsters of our worst nightmares do not always hide in dark alleys. Sometimes they live right down the street, sitting quietly at the local diner, waiting for the past to finally catch up with them. The impact of the breakthrough resonated far beyond the borders of Toronto, sending ripples through the global legal and law enforcement communities. Legal scholars, privacy advocates, and forensic experts engaged in heated debates regarding the ethical boundaries and procedural standards of investigative genetic genealogy. Yet, for the families of thousands of cold case victims around the world, the Toronto arrest provided a powerful, renewed ray of hope. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that time is no longer a protective shield for violent offenders, and that no matter how many years pass, no matter how deep a secret is buried beneath the snows of time, the unyielding pursuit of truth through science and dedication will eventually pierce the dark, expose the lies, and bring the innocent home. As the legal proceedings against the suspect began to take shape in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, the city of Toronto stood united in remembrance of Elena Vance. The quiet suburban street where she took her last steps was adorned with flowers, candles, and notes of appreciation for the cold case officers who had refused to let her memory fade. The narrative of her life, stolen so abruptly on that freezing night in 1994, was finally granted the dignified, truthful conclusion her loved ones had prayed for across 3 long decades. The cold case was cold no longer. It was a glowing, permanent testament to the triumph of light over darkness, proving that justice, though delayed, will never be denied. The meticulous reconstruction of events leading up to November 12, 1994, revealed a tragic sequence of minor coincidences that had placed Elena directly in the path of a roving predator. That evening, her usual transit bus had been delayed by 15 minutes due to a minor mechanical issue near the Scarborough Town Centre, forcing her to make a split-second decision to walk the remaining distance home rather than wait in the freezing cold at an unlit bus shelter. Witnesses interviewed during the original 1994 canvass recalled seeing a dark-colored sedan idling near the intersection of Kingston Road and Lawrence Avenue East, its engine puffing white plumes of exhaust into the sub-zero air. At the time, officers had dismissed the vehicle as a routine commuter waiting for a passenger. However, retroactively mapping the suspect's known vehicle ownership records confirmed that he had registered a dark blue domestic sedan in the spring of 1994, a vehicle that matched the precise make and model reported by 2 separate bystander statements that had sat overlooked in police archives for 31 years. This catastrophic convergence of tiny, everyday events underscored the terrifying randomness of the crime. Elena was not targeted because of who she was or anything she had done. She was targeted simply because she was alone on foot in the wrong place at the exact second a predator was searching for a victim. The realization that an innocent 19-year-old life could be violently snuffed out due to a late bus and a chance encounter added an extra layer of tragedy to an already overwhelming story. For decades, her parents had agonized over every choice made that night, wondering if a different jacket, a slightly faster walk, or a different route might have saved their daughter. The forensic resolution brought an end to that self-inflicted guilt, placing the full, unadulterated blame squarely where it belonged, on the shoulders of the man who had stalked the dark streets of Scarborough looking for someone to destroy. Inside the forensic laboratory where the critical breakthrough took place, scientists reflected on the technological leaps that had made the impossible attainable. The original biological sample, preserved in a temperature-controlled vault for over 3 decades, had suffered significant atmospheric degradation over time. Early attempts at standard STR, short tandem repeat, profiling in the early 2000s had yielded incomplete, partial results that were insufficient for upload to Canada's National DNA Databank. It was only with the advent of high-throughput next-generation sequencing, NGS, that researchers were able to read thousands of damaged genomic fragments, stitching together a complete profile that could survive advanced genealogical algorithms. This triumph highlighted the critical importance of long-term evidence preservation, serving as a powerful lesson to police departments globally that physical evidence from cold cases must be guarded as a sacred trust, waiting for future technologies to unlock its hidden secrets. As news of the arrest spread across Canada, former friends, high school classmates, and university peers of Elena Vance shared their memories on social media and at public memorial gatherings. They spoke of a bright, ambitious young woman who had dreamed of becoming a research biologist, whose infectious smile and quick wit had warmed every room she entered. The long delay in finding her killer had cast a subtle, enduring shadow over their own youth, reminding them of the fragility of life and the dark mysteries that can lurk behind familiar suburban facades. Seeing her picture restored to the headlines, not as a forgotten victim of a cold case, but as a young woman whose memory had inspired a historic breakthrough, brought a deep sense of catharsis to an entire generation of Toronto residents who had grown up under the cloud of her unsolved murder. The legal journey ahead promised to be long, complex, and emotionally charged as prosecutors prepared a formidable case built on an unshakable mountain of forensic, circumstantial, and historical evidence. The defense team signaled early on that they would challenge the procedural admissibility of investigative genetic genealogy data, raising questions about privacy rights and public database usage. However, legal experts across Canada noted that the high-stringency direct reference sample obtained via discarded abandoned DNA provided a rock-solid, independent evidentiary pillar that would be virtually impossible to overcome in court. The stage was set for a landmark legal battle that would establish firm precedents for the future use of advanced genetic technology in the Canadian justice system. Meanwhile, the multi-jurisdictional task force expanded its scope, utilizing high-resolution historical mapping and regional police databases to cross-reference the suspect's past movements against unlinked cold cases across eastern Canada. Every community where the suspect had lived, worked, or vacationed between 1980 and 2015 was systematically audited. Homicide detectives contacted retired officers who had investigated similar unsolved homicides in Hamilton, London, and Montreal, sharing evidence files and biological profiles in a relentless effort to ensure that no other victim's story remained untold. The discovery that one long-dormant crime could be solved through modern science sparked a powerful domino effect, breathing new life into dozens of forgotten files that had sat untouched for decades. In the quiet neighborhood of Scarborough, where Elena's journey had been so cruelly cut short, a permanent memorial plaque was installed near the edge of the Rouge River Ravine. Surrounded by native Canadian maples and wildflowers, the bronze plaque stands as a lasting symbol of resilience, memory, and justice. It bears Elena's name, the dates of her short life, and an inscription honoring the cold case officers and scientists whose unwavering determination brought truth to light after 31 years in the dark. The park, once associated with fear and horror, has been reclaimed by the community as a place of reflection, quiet beauty, and hope, a space where families walk, children play, and the memory of Elena Vance shines brightly, forever freed from the dark mystery that once bound it. The resolution of the Toronto 1994 cold case stands today as a monumental pillar in the history of crime narrative, a story that began with a snowy night, an abandoned coat, and 3 decades of silent agony, and ended with the absolute, uncompromising triumph of human dedication and modern science over deception. It serves as an immortal reminder to predators everywhere that time does not erase guilt, that distance does not provide safety, and that no matter how many years pass, the relentless pursuit of truth will pierce the deepest shadows, tear down the most elaborate lies, and deliver long-awaited justice for those who were stolen away. Inside the high-security investigative floor at Toronto Police Headquarters, the atmosphere during the late winter of 2025 was charged with an intense, quiet urgency. The arrest of 62-year-old retired civil engineer Arthur Pendleton in his quiet Mississauga driveway had sent shockwaves through the department, but for the cold case detectives who had lived with File 94 to 88,210 for decades, the arrest was merely the opening movement of a much larger, darker narrative. While the public celebrated the miraculous breakthrough in the 31-year-old murder of Elena Vance, specialized teams of forensic analysts, financial auditors, and behavioral profilers were quietly opening steel filing cabinets that had sat locked since the mid-1980s. They knew an undeniable, terrifying truth of criminal psychology. Predators who display the level of cold, methodical discipline required to abduct, assault, and conceal a victim in sub-zero weather without leaving a single visible trace do not simply begin and end their violence with one isolated 19-year-old university student. As forensic technicians meticulously dismantled Pendleton's manicured suburban home, pulling up floorboards, draining his backyard pool, and using ground-penetrating radar beneath his concrete garage slab, a second team began mapping his complete historical footprint across North America. Born in Hamilton in 1963, Pendleton had earned his engineering degree from University of Toronto in the early 1980s, a detail that immediately placed him within walking distance of several unsolved missing persons cases that had plagued the Greater Toronto Area during his undergraduate years. Detectives began digitizing thousands of paper records from municipal transit authorities, former residential leases, expired passport applications, and corporate travel vouchers from the three major engineering firms that had employed him over his four-decade career. What emerged was a startling pattern of geographical overlap between Pendleton's documented business trips and a string of long-dormant, highly similar cold cases spanning three provinces and two American border states. The first major anomaly flagged by the task force's algorithmic mapping software centered on the winter of 1988, 6 years before Elena Vance was stolen from her quiet walk home in Scarborough. In February of that year, 21-year-old nursing student Clara Mercer had vanished after leaving a late-night study session at a hospital campus in London, Ontario. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a snowbank near a remote railway spur line, showing the exact same signature of blunt force trauma, asphyxiation, and careful concealment under discarded industrial materials. At the time, London police had pursued several local suspects, but the investigation eventually collapsed into a permanent stalemate. When Toronto investigators cross-referenced corporate expense logs from Pendleton's early engineering firm, they discovered a damning piece of historical evidence. Pendleton had been dispatched to London for an emergency structural audit on a highway bridge project on the exact afternoon Clara Mercer disappeared, checking out of a local motel less than 3 hours before her body was estimated to have been dumped. This chilling discovery prompted the immediate expansion of the task force, officially designated as Operation Northern Timber. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, working alongside provincial authorities in Ontario and Quebec, as well as federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, established a centralized command post dedicated exclusively to auditing Pendleton's movements between 1980 and 2020. Inside the command room, giant digital map displays lit up the walls, connecting red pins representing Pendleton's verified hotel stays, job sites, and vacation rentals with blue pins representing unsolved abductions of young women along quiet suburban transit corridors. The horrifying reality began to dawn on investigators. Arthur Pendleton was not just a local suburban resident who had committed a single, tragic crime in 1994. He was potentially one of the most prolific, covert serial predators in modern Canadian history, hiding beneath the unblemished mask of a quiet family man, a devoted youth sports coach, and a respected corporate professional. Inside the interrogation room, however, Pendleton presented an impenetrable, stone-faced facade. Sitting across from veteran homicide interrogators, wearing an orange institutional jumpsuit, his thin gray hair neatly parted, he maintained a soft-spoken, polite demeanor that stood in sickening contrast to the monstrous acts attributed to him. He refused to answer direct questions about Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, or any of the other cold cases linked to his travel history. When presented with high-resolution photographic evidence of the brass-zippered canvas backpack recovered from the Rouge River Ravine in 1994, Pendleton merely blinked behind his wire-rimmed glasses, folded his hands neatly on the metal table, and reiterated his demand for legal counsel. His calm, detached composure revealed a man who had spent 31 years mastering the art of compartmentalization, a man who had successfully convinced his wife, children, colleagues, and neighbors that he was a gentle, harmless pillar of suburban society while carrying a dark, blood-stained secret in his soul. While interrogators worked to break Pendleton's psychological defense, forensic geneticists at the Regional Crime Laboratory achieved a second major technical breakthrough. Utilizing the same advanced next-generation sequencing protocols that had identified Pendleton in Elena Vance's case, scientists successfully extracted trace biological material from microscopic fabric fibers preserved in Clara Mercer's 1988 evidence locker. Despite 37 years of physical degradation, the laboratory generated a high-stringency genomic profile that was fed directly into the comparative database. At 3:15 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning, the system produced a definitive, unequivocal match. The biological material recovered from Clara Mercer's winter coat belonged to Arthur Pendleton. The legal foundation was rapidly solidifying, turning what had once been a single cold case resolution into an undeniable multi-jurisdictional murder prosecution. The news of the second cold case link sent renewed shockwaves through the Canadian media landscape. Headlines across the country declared the unraveling of a decades-long nightmare, sparking intense national debate regarding how a predator could operate with absolute impunity for so long across major urban centers. Community members who had known Pendleton for years were paralyzed with shock and disbelief. Neighbors on his quiet Mississauga cul-de-sac recalled how he had hosted annual summer block parties, assisted elderly residents with snow clearing during harsh Canadian winters, and regularly volunteered at local food drives. The terrifying realization that a serial killer had been living among them, waving friendly greetings from his lawnmower while carrying the weight of multiple stolen lives, transformed the suburban neighborhood into a place of deep, lingering paranoia. For the family of Clara Mercer, who had lived in the suffocating darkness of unanswered questions since 1988, the sudden phone call from the London Police Service brought an overwhelming flood of tears, relief, and revived heartbreak. Clara's aging mother, now in her late 80s, held a framed photograph of her daughter as senior detectives explained how modern genetic science had finally exposed her killer after nearly 4 decades. The resolution of Mercer's case validated the persistent efforts of retired detectives who had refused to allow her file to be purged or forgotten, proving that physical evidence, when safeguarded with reverent care, possesses an immortal voice that time cannot silence. As the task force broadened its audit into Pendleton's international travels, specifically examining several multi-week engineering assignments in upstate New York, Michigan, and Ohio during the late 1990s, federal agents in the United States opened their own cold case archives. Forensic units in Buffalo and Detroit began retrieving stored evidence from unresolved homicides that shared Pendleton's distinct modus operandi: young women targeted near transit hubs during severe winter weather, subjected to sudden blunt force violence, and concealed beneath industrial debris in remote access areas. The realization that Pendleton's path of destruction might extend across international borders elevated the case to one of the highest priority federal investigations in North America, setting the stage for a massive, multinational prosecution that would redefine the boundaries of modern cold case forensics. Back in Toronto, prosecutors with the Ministry of the Attorney General began drafting an unprecedented, multi-count indictment charging Pendleton with first-degree murder across multiple jurisdictions. The legal strategy aimed to join the cases into a single, comprehensive trial, presenting the court with an overwhelming tapestry of genetic, circumstantial, and historical evidence that would shatter any possibility of defense claims regarding secondary contamination or coincidental presence. The stage was set for a historic judicial battle, one that would not only seek ultimate accountability for Elena Vance and Clara Mercer, but would permanently expose the terrifying reality of a predator who had used the quiet cover of Canadian winter and suburban anonymity to wage a silent, decades-long war against the innocent. By the late spring of 2025, the multi-jurisdictional dragnet known as Operation Northern Timber had expanded across the international border, transforming what began as a localized Toronto cold case resolution into one of the most complex cross-border serial murder investigations in North American history. As the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Toronto Police Service deepened their coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, detectives from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia, arrived in Ontario to assist in synthesizing 4 decades of logistical, financial, and forensic data. The Digital Command Center at Toronto Police Headquarters now tracked a terrifying web of overlapping data points spanning 3 Canadian provinces and 5 Northern American states. Every road trip, every highway toll receipt, every corporate credit card transaction, and every municipal engineering permit associated with Arthur Pendleton between 1980 and 2015 was being subjected to microscopic forensic scrutiny. The first major breakthrough on American soil occurred inside the evidence vaults of the Erie County Sheriff's Office in upstate New York. In December 1999, during a catastrophic lake-effect snowstorm that paralyzed the region surrounding Buffalo, 22-year-old graduate student Hannah Vance, unrelated to Elena Vance, but bound to her by a tragic twist of fate, had disappeared after her sedan stalled along a desolate stretch of Interstate 90. Her vehicle was discovered idling on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking, her purse and coat still sitting on the front passenger seat. 2 weeks later, as snowplows cleared accumulated drifts near a highway maintenance yard near Cheektowaga, road crews uncovered her frozen body hidden beneath a discarded steel culvert. The cause of death mirrored the horrific signatures documented in Scarborough and London: severe blunt force trauma, asphyxiation, and the deliberate, methodical concealment under industrial debris. For 26 years, Hannah Vance's murder had remained an open wound for the state police investigators who had combed the snowbound interstate looking for a phantom driver. But in April 2025, following an urgent bulletin issued through Interpol, New York State Police forensic biologists retrieved the preserved physical evidence from the 1999 Cheektowaga crime scene. Microscopic fibers extracted from the victim's knitted scarf, fibers that had been carefully stored in a vacuum-sealed glass glassine envelope, were submitted for high-sensitivity genomic processing at a federal laboratory in Albany. Within 48 hours, the result reverberated through the command center in Toronto. Touch DNA recovered from the interior weave of the scarf yielded a full-string genomic profile that matched Arthur Pendleton with absolute mathematical certainty. The confirmation of a third murder, this one committed across an international border, fundamentally altered the legal and political landscape of the prosecution. The United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of New York immediately initiated formal capital murder indictment filings, opening high-level diplomatic discussions between the U.S. Department of Justice and the Canadian Department of Justice regarding jurisdictional priority, extradition protocols, and joint trial proceedings. The news that a quiet, retired civil engineer from Mississauga was now definitively linked to violent crimes on both sides of the Niagara River dominated international news broadcasts, sparking intense public fascination and widespread horror at the sheer scope of a predator's unchecked mobility. While legal scholars and diplomats debated the complex mechanics of cross-border prosecution, tactical search units executed a high-priority search warrant at a remote property owned by Pendleton in the rugged, heavily forested backcountry near Parry Sound, Ontario. The 4-acre parcel, purchased by Pendleton under a private holding company in 1992, featured a secluded, winterized timber cabin accessible only by a single-lane, unpaved logging track. For decades, neighbors in the surrounding township had viewed Pendleton as an occasional seasonal visitor, a quiet, polite outdoorsman who came north during the autumn hunting season and spent his weekends repairing timber decking or chopping firewood. When tactical officers and forensic teams breached the cabin on a drizzly May morning, they uncovered a hidden environment that shattered any remaining lingering doubts regarding Pendleton's true nature. Beneath the heavy oak floorboards of a tool shed adjoining the main cabin, ground-penetrating radar picked up a distinct structural anomaly. Digging through 6 feet of packed gravel and reinforced concrete, technicians uncovered a padlocked, moisture-sealed steel storage trunk buried deep within the frozen earth. When the lock was breached under the glaring beams of portable halogen lights, seasoned homicide detectives stood in stunned, heavy silence at the contents lying inside. The steel trunk was a meticulously arranged trophy vault. Inside, neatly cataloged in individual Ziploc bags alongside handwritten index cards bearing dates and geographical coordinates, were dozens of personal items belonging to young women whose names had populated cold case registries across North America for 40 years. Detectives identified a silver charm bracelet belonging to Clara Mercer, a scratched university library card bearing the photograph of Elena Vance, and a brass key ring belonging to Hannah Vance. But alongside these known items lay more than 20 additional personal effects: silver earrings, broken hair clips, engraved wristwatches, and small leather coin purses that did not match any current victim in the active indictment. The discovery of the Parry Sound storage bunker transformed Operation Northern Timber from a targeted investigation into an active, emergency recovery operation of monumental proportions. The forensic evidence extracted from the trunk confirmed the worst fears of behavioral analysts. Arthur Pendleton was not merely a serial killer who struck when opportunity arose. He was a methodical, obsessive collector of human lives who kept meticulous records of his atrocities, preserving tangible mementos of his victims in a subterranean vault that he had visited repeatedly across 4 decades. Each item represented a stolen life, a ruined family, and a cold case file waiting to be unlocked by modern science. Back at Toronto Police Headquarters, the atmosphere inside the interrogation wing grew increasingly tense as lead investigators confronted Pendleton with high-resolution photographs of the recovered trophy trunk. Facing the physical artifacts of his victims, items he had buried in the northern woods decades earlier, the 62-year-old suspect suffered a visible, catastrophic break in his stoic composure. For 31 years, Pendleton had operated under the absolute conviction that his intelligence, his engineering precision, and the passage of time made him entirely invisible to the law. Seeing his private sanctuary exposed, his trophies laid bare on a stainless steel table, his hands began to tremble violently, and the quiet, polite demeanor he had maintained since his arrest dissolved into an icy, hollow stare. Over the course of a harrowing, 14-hour interrogation session that stretched through the night, Pendleton began to speak in a flat, emotionless monotone, providing chilling details regarding the mechanics of his hunting strategy. He described how he utilized his corporate engineering credentials to travel unnoticed along major transit corridors during severe winter weather, intentionally selecting nights when heavy snowfall and extreme cold would obscure physical footprints, delay police response times, and degrade trace biological evidence. He admitted to stalking transit hubs, highway rest stops, and quiet residential streets, waiting patiently inside his vehicle until an isolated victim emerged into the storm. His cold, clinical descriptions of the abductions sent chills through the veteran detectives sitting across from him. Pendleton discussed his violent acts not with remorse or emotional distress, but with the detached, analytical perspective of a structural engineer discussing a material failure test. He detailed how he used industrial debris, discarded concrete culverts, abandoned railway ties, and heavy timber to weigh down and conceal his victims, trusting that the freezing Canadian climate would preserve his secrets until the spring thaw washed away any remaining physical clues. As transcripts of Pendleton's partial confession were summarized in sealed court filings, the legal teams representing the families of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, and Hannah Vance issued a joint statement outside the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Standing side by side on the marble steps beneath a canopy of rain umbrellas, the grieving relatives expressed profound gratitude to the forensic scientists, cold case officers, and federal agents whose relentless dedication had brought the truth into the light. But they also spoke of the agonizing reality facing dozens of other families whose loved ones' personal items had been recovered from the Parry Sound bunker, families who were now waiting in agonizing suspension for DNA confirmation that their long-missing daughters were among the victims cataloged in Pendleton's dark archive. The international scientific community watched the unfolding events in Toronto with intense, unprecedented interest. The successful integration of investigative genetic genealogy, high-throughput genomic sequencing, and subterranean forensic excavation in the Pendleton case was hailed by legal and forensic experts as a historic turning point in the global fight against unsolved violent crime. Universities and crime laboratories across Europe, Asia, and the Americas began updating their research protocols, recognizing that the combination of advanced molecular science and multi-jurisdictional archival auditing had created a revolutionary template for dismantling even the most deeply entrenched criminal deceptions. As the summer of 2025 approached, the city of Toronto stood on the threshold of an unprecedented judicial proceeding. The Ministry of the Attorney General of Ontario, working in direct concert with the United States Department of Justice, announced plans to hold a historic joint evidentiary hearing that would formally present the mountain of forensic and physical evidence gathered across two nations. The trial promised to be a grueling, emotionally heavy reckoning, a process that would force a community to look directly into the face of a hidden predator who had lived among them for 40 years, while offering a long-overdue measure of justice for the innocent lives stolen in the dark. In the quiet suburban enclave of Scarborough, where Elena Vance took her last steps in the snowy darkness of November 1994, the community gathered for an evening vigil at the edge of the Rouge River Ravine. Hundreds of residents, young and old, held flickering white candles against the night sky, their voices rising in a quiet chorus of remembrance. The fear that had gripped the neighborhood for 3 decades had been permanently lifted, replaced by a deep, collective resolve to honor the memory of Elena and all the victims whose stories had finally been reclaimed from the shadows of the past. The cold case that had haunted a city for 31 years was cold no longer. It was a burning, eternal testament to the unyielding power of truth, science, and justice. By the midsummer of 2025, as the forensic audit of the Parry Sound timber cabin reached its formal conclusion, the scope of Operation Northern Timber had expanded far beyond the initial boundaries of standard criminal prosecution. What had started as a single cold case breakthrough in Scarborough had transformed into a massive, multi-tiered forensic mapping exercise requiring the complete cataloging of thousands of physical, biological, and digital artifacts. Inside the high-security evidence vault at Toronto Police Headquarters, the cataloging team worked in continuous rotating shifts, carefully processing each item retrieved from Arthur Pendleton's subterranean storage bunker. The small, ordinary objects, a faded leather coin purse, a tarnished silver bracelet, a scratched brass key ring, represented a harrowing cross-section of stolen young lives, each item waiting for modern molecular science to restore its owner's name. The evidentiary processing phase required an unprecedented level of interagency coordination. Forensic geneticists from the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences worked shoulder to shoulder with special agents from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and digital forensics experts from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Utilizing high-throughput next-generation sequencing, the laboratory process traced biological material extracted from the fabric linings, metal clasps, and leather surfaces of the recovered personal items. Every recovered genetic profile was immediately run against the international comparative database established for the task force. Within weeks, the system began returning confirmed matches to long-dormant missing persons files and unsolved cold cases spanning across Ontario, Quebec, New York, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, dating back to the late 1970s. Among the most devastating revelations to emerge from the laboratory analysis was the definitive link to the September 1983 disappearance of 20-year-old art student Evelyn Vance, another tragic, haunting coincidence in surname that chilled investigators to the core. Evelyn had vanished after stepping off an inner-city bus in downtown Hamilton, Ontario, during a heavy autumn rainstorm. For 42 years, her family had lived in an agonizing void, with no physical evidence ever recovered to indicate her fate. When forensic technicians processed a silver ring with an inlaid turquoise stone found inside baggie 14 of the Parry Sound trunk, high-stringency genomic analysis revealed microscopic skin cell deposits matching Evelyn Vance's surviving sister. The 42-year mystery was solved in an instant, bringing a wave of painful, quiet closure to a family that had spent over 4 decades searching for answers. As the body of physical evidence grew into an insurmountable mountain, prosecutors from the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General and federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office assembled a joint legal strategy. The goal was to construct an airtight, master multi-jurisdictional indictment that would charge Arthur Pendleton with multiple counts of first-degree murder across international boundaries. Legal teams met in secure conference rooms in Toronto and Buffalo, drafting procedural motions to ensure that all evidence obtained through investigative genetic genealogy, abandoned DNA surveillance, and subterranean search warrants would withstand the most rigorous constitutional challenges. The prosecution sought to establish a precedent-setting framework for joint international trials in serial violence cases, ensuring that every victim's charge could be presented before a single, unified judicial panel. Inside the high-security detention facility, where Pendleton was held under round-the-clock suicide watch, defense attorneys attempted to build a strategy centered on mental competency and procedural exclusion. They filed preliminary motions challenging the legality of the discarded coffee cup DNA collection in Mississauga, arguing that the covert recovery violated privacy protections under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They also raised technical objections regarding the use of commercial genealogical databases, attempting to block the introduction of family tree mapping data in court. However, the prosecution's response was swift and definitive. Case law established across multiple appellate jurisdictions firmly upheld the doctrine that abandoned biological material in public space carries no reasonable expectation of privacy and that secondary direct reference testing provides an independent, unshakable evidentiary pillar. While the legal battle took shape in the courtrooms, behavioral profilers conducted an exhaustive retrospective analysis of Pendleton's daily routine, psychological disposition, and professional career. They sought to understand how a man capable of such calculated, cold-blooded violence could maintain an unblemished public record for over 40 years without raising a single red flag. Interviews with former corporate colleagues, neighbors, and sports league volunteers revealed a masterclass in psychological masking. Pendleton was consistently described as an extraordinarily punctual, detail-oriented engineer who excelled at logistical management, project scheduling, and structural calculations. His professional life was defined by strict adherence to rules and procedures, a rigid discipline that he inverted in secret to execute, conceal, and archive his horrific violent crimes with mathematical precision. The behavioral analysis further revealed how Pendleton deliberately weaponized weather patterns and environmental conditions to execute his hunting strategy. He kept detailed meteorological journals dating back to 1978, recording snowfall accumulations, temperature drops, wind directions, and municipal snowplow schedules across major transportation corridors in the Northeast. He understood that severe winter storms provided the ideal operational cover. Street visibility was near zero, police response times were delayed, potential witnesses remained indoors, and heavy snow accumulation immediately buried physical tracks while freezing and preserving biological evidence until environmental exposure washed it away during the spring thaw. His crimes were not impulsive outbursts of passion. They were meticulously planned, weather-synchronized operations executed with the cold efficiency of an industrial process. As news of the expanded multi-jurisdictional charges broke across national news outlets, the social impact on the affected communities was profound and far-reaching. In cities where cold cases had sat stagnant for decades, local law enforcement agencies established dedicated victim support teams to assist families who were suddenly confronted with the overwhelming reality of a resolved investigation. Public forums and town hall meetings were held in Scarborough, London, Hamilton, and Buffalo, providing community members with an outlet to process the historical grief and shock that had lingered beneath the surface of their neighborhoods for generations. The realization that a single, hidden predator had been the common thread weaving through decades of local heartbreak brought a complex mixture of horror, relief, and profound collective catharsis. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Mississauga where Pendleton had lived until his arrest, the physical presence of the investigation began to recede, but the psychological landscape was permanently altered. The manicured property on the quiet cul-de-sac stood empty, its windows dark and its driveway cordoned off by official seals. Neighbors who had once shared morning greetings across pristine hedges reflected on the terrifying reality of human deception. The case served as a permanent, chilling reminder that high suburban fences and friendly smiles can conceal the darkest of human impulses, and that true monsters do not always exist in distant myths. They can live right next door, tending their lawns and living among the very people they seek to destroy. By the late autumn of 2025, as preliminary hearings approached in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, the legacy of File 94 to 88,210 had become an indelible watershed moment in the history of international law enforcement. The seamless integration of advanced molecular biology, forensic genealogy, archival auditing, and cross-border prosecutorial cooperation had created a modern blueprint for justice that would reverberate through police academies and legal institutions for decades to come. The message sent to violent offenders worldwide was clear and uncompromising. Time does not grant immunity, distance does not offer protection, and no secret buried in the freezing earth can forever withstand the relentless, unyielding light of truth and scientific precision. As the winter of 2025 descended upon Ontario, bringing sub-zero temperatures and biting winds similar to those recorded on the night Elena Vance vanished in 1994, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice convened for the start of the pre-trial evidentiary hearings. Inside the crowded, high-security courtroom in downtown Toronto, the air was dense with anticipation. Media correspondents from across North America packed the gallery, sitting alongside quiet, stone-faced family members of the victims. In the dock sat Arthur Pendleton, dressed in a sharp dark suit, looking like nothing more than a retired professional sitting through a routine corporate board meeting. Yet, directly in front of the judge lay 4 decades of meticulously cataloged evidence, an unyielding tower of scientific data, legal filings, and physical artifacts that represented a catastrophic reckoning for the man who had believed he was untouchable. The primary objective of these pretrial proceedings was to address the defense team's aggressive motions to suppress the core genetic evidence. Defense counsel argued vehemently that the procurement of Pendleton's abandoned DNA from a discarded coffee cup in a public parking lot constituted an illegal search and seizure without a warrant, violating constitutional protections against unreasonable intrusion. They further contended that the use of public investigative genetic genealogy databases breached the fundamental privacy rights of millions of unwitting citizens whose DNA profiles were stored in open-access registries. The defense asserted that if the initial genetic lineage search was ruled inadmissible, the subsequent search warrants executed at Pendleton's Mississauga home and the Perry Sound timber cabin would crumble under the legal doctrine of the poisonous tree. The prosecution, led by a formidable team of senior Crown attorneys and federal prosecutors, launched a masterclass in modern legal presentation. Step by step, they called elite forensic geneticists, constitutional scholars, and senior homicide investigators to the witness stand. The experts systematically demonstrated that abandoned biological material left in a public venue carries no expectation of privacy under long-established common law precedents. Furthermore, the Crown established that investigative genetic genealogy did not pinpoint Pendleton directly, but rather served as a modern, hyper-precise investigative lead generator, no different from a tip called in by a member of the public or an anonymous informant. The ultimate, definitive identification rested solely on the direct, high-stringency comparative profiling conducted between his verified reference sample and the preserved trace biological evidence recovered from Elena Vance's garments. Over 3 grueling weeks of technical testimony, the court heard granular details regarding the revolutionary next-generation sequencing protocols applied to the 31-year-old evidence. Forensic scientists walked the court through the complex chemical extraction processes that successfully isolated pristine genomic strands from degraded, microscopic touch DNA trapped beneath the dried blood on the internal zipper of Elena's canvas backpack. The mathematical certainty presented to the court was staggering. The probability that the biological profile recovered from the 1994 Scarborough crime scene belonged to anyone other than Arthur Pendleton was calculated at less than 1 in 1 trillion, a figure exceeding the total number of human beings who have ever lived on Earth. At the conclusion of the arguments, the presiding judge issued a historic, lengthy ruling that reverberated through the Canadian legal establishment. The court unequivocally denied all defense suppression motions, declaring that the law enforcement tactics utilized in Operation Northern Timber were not only constitutionally sound, but represented a monumental advancement in the pursuit of truth and public safety. The judge noted that time does not diminish the state's mandate to seek justice for victims of violent crime, nor does a perpetrator acquire a legal right to privacy over trace evidence left behind at a brutal crime scene. With the genetic evidence firmly locked into the official court record, the defense's strategy was effectively shattered, clearing the runway for the formal criminal trial to proceed. While the legal battle played out in the courtroom, the multi-jurisdictional task force continued its relentless audit of Pendleton's historical movements during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Digital reconstruction teams mapped out every highway project, bridge inspection, and municipal site audit Pendleton had managed during his decades-long tenure as a senior civil engineer. By cross-referencing these verified work schedules with regional transit logs and unsolved missing persons registries across eastern Canada, investigators uncovered a chilling correlation. Pendleton had repeatedly requested solitary field assignments during severe winter weather events, intentionally positioning himself near high-volume transit nodes in secondary cities like Barrie, Peterborough, and Kingston precisely when severe snowstorms were forecasted to hit the region. This revelation exposed the true depth of Pendleton's calculated predation. He was not an opportunistic killer who happened to stumble upon victims. He was a cold-blooded, weather-monitoring strategist who used his professional mobility as a hunting pass. His deep understanding of municipal infrastructure allowed him to navigate urban drainage systems, industrial access roads, and remote rail corridors with complete confidence, knowing exactly where municipal crews would dump cleared snow and where physical evidence could lie buried and undisturbed for months. The quiet civil engineer had systematically turned the harsh Canadian climate into an active accomplice in his violence. Inside the detention center, as the weight of the judge's ruling settled over the defense camp, the psychological cracks in Pendleton's stone-faced demeanor began to widen into profound fractures. Stripped of his legal maneuvers and confronted with the impending reality of a televised multi-count murder trial, Pendleton requested a private audience with his lead defense attorney and the Crown prosecutors. For the first time since his arrest in the spring of 2025, the 62-year-old suspect signaled a willingness to negotiate a formal resolution, a move driven not by genuine remorse or empathy for the families he had destroyed, but by an overwhelming, narcissistic desire to avoid the public exposure of his private archives during a lengthy, high-profile trial. The prosecution's stance during these high-stakes plea discussions was absolute and unyielding. The Crown made it abundantly clear that no plea bargain would be considered unless it included an unconditional, full-spectrum confession to every act of violence committed across all jurisdictions, complete cooperation in identifying all remaining unlinked personal effects recovered from the Parry Sound bunker, and a permanent waiver of all appeal rights. There would be no reduced charges, no eligibility for early parole, and no concessions regarding his security classification. Arthur Pendleton would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the steel doors of a maximum security federal penitentiary. As news leaked that plea negotiations were underway, a tense, quiet calm fell over the families of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, Hannah Vance, and Evelyn Vance. For decades, these families had lived in an agonizing vacuum of unanswered questions, forced to endure anniversaries, holidays, and milestones under the crushing weight of unresolved grief. The prospect of an absolute, legally binding admission of guilt offered something that decades of police work had never been able to deliver, an unquestionable, permanent truth that would forever strip the killer of his lies and grant their loved ones the dignified, public closure they had prayed for across generations. The formal plea hearing was scheduled for an early winter morning in early 2026, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged moments in Canadian judicial history. The courtroom, packed to its absolute physical capacity, stood in breathless silence as Arthur Pendleton was led inside by armed transport officers. The air was thick with 40 years of accumulated grief, anger, and anticipation. The time for speculation, mystery, and phantom sedans was over. The unyielding light of modern forensic science had backed the predator into a corner from which there was no escape, ready to deliver a final, historic judgment that would echo through the annals of justice forever. The formal plea hearing on the cold morning of January 14, 2026, stood as a watershed moment in the annals of North American jurisprudence. Inside Courtroom 401 of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Every wooden bench was filled to capacity with family members, retired cold case detectives, forensic scientists, and international journalists. As Arthur Pendleton was escorted into the room, wearing a plain gray prison jumpsuit, he no longer carried the calm, composed air of a respected Mississauga civil engineer. His posture was slouched, his eyes darting anxiously around the packed gallery, unable to meet the steady, unyielding gazes of those whose lives he had shattered across 4 decades. The presiding judge called the court to order, and the chief Crown prosecutor stood to read the comprehensive statement of agreed facts. For 3 uninterrupted hours, the prosecutor's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, laying out the chilling details of Operation Northern Timber. The court listened in horrified silence as the full narrative was formally articulated into the public record. How Pendleton had utilized his corporate engineering travel schedules, weather forecasting, and municipal infrastructure access to hunt young women during severe winter storms. How he had systematically concealed their bodies beneath heavy industrial debris in snowbound ravines and maintenance yards. And how he had kept meticulous records and personal trophies buried in a padlocked steel trunk deep beneath his timber cabin in Parry Sound. When called upon by the judge to enter his formal plea, Pendleton stood before the bench, his voice barely above a whisper. One by one, as the clerk read out the multi-jurisdictional counts of first-degree murder, including the 1983 murder of Evelyn Vance in Hamilton, the 1988 murder of Clara Mercer in London, the 1994 murder of Elena Vance in Scarborough, and the 1999 murder of Hannah Vance in Cheektowaga, New York, Pendleton uttered the same word 6 consecutive times. Guilty. The word fell like an iron hammer, shattering 31 years of elaborate deceptions, false leads, and phantom vehicles. There was no longer any room for doubt, no theoretical legal technicalities to exploit, and no lingering mystery to hide behind. The perpetrator had been brought to his knees by an unyielding wall of genomic truth. Following the formal entry of the guilty pleas, the proceedings transitioned into the victim impact statements, emotionally raw, profoundly cathartic phase of the judicial process. Representatives from each affected family took the podium, facing the man who had stolen their daughters, sisters, and friends. Elena Vance's older brother stood before the bench, holding a small framed photograph of Elena taken just weeks before her disappearance in 1994. Looking directly at Pendleton, he spoke with quiet, trembling strength about the agonizing void that had haunted their household for 31 years, the endless nights his parents had spent staring out the front window at the empty street, and the heartbreaking realization that the helpful neighbor who had offered words of comfort in the days following her vanishing was, in reality, her murderer. For 3 decades, you thought you were smarter than the world, her brother declared, his voice cutting through the silent courtroom. You thought the cold, the snow, and the passage of time would protect you. You thought my sister was just a forgotten file on a shelf. But you underestimated the power of truth. You underestimated the relentless dedication of people who loved her and the brilliant minds who used the tiny mark you left behind on a zipper to track you down. You are not a mastermind, Arthur. You are a coward who will die alone in the dark, while Elena's name will live on in light, justice, and truth. The judge then delivered the mandatory statutory sentence: multiple consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, ensuring that the 63-year-old convict would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life behind the walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. In his closing remarks, the judge offered a scathing assessment of Pendleton's actions, contrasting the calculated brutality of his crimes with the extraordinary triumph of modern forensic science and interagency collaboration. The judge lauded the pioneering efforts of the forensic geneticists and cold case detectives who had refused to allow File 94 to 88,210 to fade into obscurity, noting that the case had forever changed the global standard for criminal investigations. As Pendleton was led away in heavy iron restraints, his legacy cemented not as a quiet, successful engineer, but as one of the most monstrous serial predators in modern Canadian history. A profound wave of relief washed over the gallery. Outside the courthouse, under a crisp winter sky, prosecutors, lead detectives, and family members held a joint press conference. The lead homicide detective on the Vance case, who had spent over 15 years working the file, stood before a wall of television cameras and microphones. With visible emotion, he officially held up the original physical folder of File 94 to 88,210, took a red rubber stamp, and pressed it firmly onto the cover. Closed, solved by forensic genealogy. The formal conclusion of the trial did not mark the end of the scientific and institutional revolution sparked by the case. The success of the Jenkins-Vance protocol, the advanced chemical matrix extraction and high-throughput sequencing methods developed during the investigation, was formally integrated into standard operating procedures for crime laboratories across North America and Europe. Specialized cold case units in dozens of police departments established dedicated genetic genealogy desks, systematically reviewing thousands of unlinked violent crime files dating back to the mid-20th century. The era of cold case impunity was officially at an end. Trace biological evidence, no matter how minute or degraded, had become a permanent, ticking clock for violent offenders worldwide. In the quiet Scarborough neighborhood where Elena Vance had walked her final steps in November 1994, the community gathered weeks later for a quiet ceremony near the edge of the Rouge River Ravine. The temporary memorial plaque that had been installed earlier was replaced with a permanent bronze monument, surrounded by newly planted native trees and a stone bench. The inscription honored not only Elena, but all the victims whose identities had been reclaimed from the dark through the relentless pursuit of justice. Residents walked past the quiet spot with a sense of restored peace. The shadow that had hung over the suburb for 3 decades had been permanently lifted. File 94 to 88,210 stands today as an immortal, unyielding pillar in the history of international crime narrative, a powerful testament to the triumph of human resilience, scientific innovation, and moral clarity over deception. It serves as an eternal reminder to the world that time does not erase guilt, that no lie can forever hide the facts, and that no matter how deep a secret is buried beneath the snows of time, the unyielding light of truth will always pierce the deepest darkness to set the innocent free. In the months following the historic sentencing of Arthur Pendleton, the long-term institutional, scientific, and societal ripples of Operation Northern Timber began to fundamentally alter the structural DNA of global law enforcement. While the physical file of 94 to 88,210 was officially stamped closed inside the Toronto Homicide Division, its scientific framework became an active, living paradigm across international forensic institutes. The multi-agency success demonstrated that decades of environmental degradation, intentional evidence concealment, and sophisticated behavioral masking could be systematically neutralized by the precise application of advanced genomic sequencing and high-stringency genealogical mapping. At police headquarters across North America, Western Europe, and Australasia, dedicated units were established to conduct exhaustive, automated audits of dormant physical evidence lockers. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, in close collaboration with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Interpol, established the Global Genetic Audit Initiative, an international consortium designed to standardize the extraction and preservation of microscale biological samples recovered from cold cases originating between 1960 and 2010. Forensic technicians who had once viewed microscopic, degraded touch DNA as scientifically unviable were trained in the Jenkins-Vance protocol, utilizing specialized chemical matrix isolation techniques to unlock deep genomic profiles from items previously considered hopelessly contaminated. The immediate operational impact of this global rollout was nothing short of extraordinary. Within the first 6 months of 2026, crime laboratories utilizing the protocol reported the definitive resolution of over 100 long-standing cold case homicides, sexual assaults, and missing persons investigations. Long-dormant files in major metropolitan centers and isolated rural townships alike were systematically matched to violent offenders who had operated under the assumption that the passage of time had rendered them immune to justice. Old evidence boxes containing faded swatches of fabric, rusted metallic artifacts, and brittle slide mounts were retrieved from dust-covered storage facilities, yielding microscopic cellular deposits that spoke with absolute, mathematical clarity across multi-decade divides. In Ontario, the academic and legal legacies of the case converged at the University of Toronto's Centre for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, where a specialized research chair was established in memory of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, Hannah Vance, and Evelyn Vance. The initiative brought together leading geneticists, legal scholars, constitutional experts, and behavioral profilers to examine the complex ethical and procedural frontiers of investigative genetic genealogy. The curriculum focused extensively on the psychological profiles of proximity-based serial predators, individuals like Pendleton who actively integrated themselves into civic, corporate, and neighborhood structures to construct an impenetrable persona of quiet respectability while waging a covert war against the vulnerable. Criminologists analyzed thousands of hours of Pendleton's post-conviction psychiatric interviews, mapping out the precise cognitive mechanisms of his performative compartmentalization. The research revealed that Pendleton's ability to evade detection for over 40 years rested not on extraordinary criminal genius, but on his calculated exploitation of procedural blind spots inherent to late 20th century policing. By maintaining immaculate corporate attendance records, volunteering for civic organizations, and offering polite, low-profile assistance during community crises, he had successfully created a protective psychological barrier that kept local investigators from ever considering him as a potential subject. The findings led to major revisions in behavioral profiling manuals, instructing modern detectives to look beyond surface-level community standing and focus objectively on physical mobility, logistical access, and verifiable forensic clearance. For the surviving members of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families, the post-trial era brought a quiet, deep, and enduring peace that had eluded them across generations. The joint advocacy coalition they had forged during the darkest hours of the investigation expanded its reach internationally, successfully lobbying state, provincial, and federal legislatures to pass the Forensic Preservation and Equity Act. The landmark legislation mandated permanent, state-funded storage for all physical evidence recovered in unsolved violent crime investigations, ensuring that no police department, regardless of size or budget constraints, could ever discard biological material that might hold the key to a future scientific breakthrough. In Scarborough, near the quiet residential cul-de-sac where Elena Vance had walked her final steps on that freezing November night in 1994, the landscape had undergone a quiet, profound transformation. The edge of the Rouge River ravine, once shrouded in fear and silent suspicion, had been fully restored as a public memorial park. Tall native maples, white pines, and wild-flowering shrubs surrounded a winding stone path leading to a central granite monument. On warm spring afternoons, community members walked their dogs, parents pushed strollers, and students from nearby high schools sat on wooden benches reading textbooks, bathed in sunlight. There were no longer any lingering shadows, no unvoiced fears, and no phantom sedans haunting the streets. File 94 to 88,210 was no longer a symbol of agonizing loss or cold case failure. It stood as an immortal, unyielding monument to the triumph of truth over deception, science over obscurity, and justice over time. It remains an eternal warning to violent offenders across the world that no lie can outrun the relentless march of technological innovation, that no secret buried in the freezing earth is safe from discovery, and that the unyielding light of dedicated human resolve will always pierce the deepest darkness to set the innocent free. By the late summer of 2026, the global impact of the Operation Northern Timber convictions had crystallized into a permanent, structural shift across the landscape of criminal justice. The successful prosecution of Arthur Pendleton, a case born from the frozen soil of Scarborough in 1994 and resolved through the precise deployment of investigative genetic genealogy, was no longer viewed simply as a singular legal victory. It was now recognized as the definitive foundational blueprint for 21st century cold case enforcement, completely dismantling the traditional assumptions surrounding evidence degradation, geographical displacement, and suspect profiling. Inside the specialized units of international law enforcement agencies, the procedural methodologies forged during the investigation were formally codified into standard operational directives. Interpol, in direct collaboration with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, published the finalized Pendleton-Vance investigative protocols. This comprehensive multi-volume manual provided police forces across 85 member nations with a standardized, step-by-step framework for re-evaluating historical violent crime files. The protocol established strict mandates for the cataloging of microscale biological evidence, the ethical utilization of open-source genomic databases, and the systematic auditing of historical corporate, infrastructure, and meteorological records. Central to this new operational philosophy was the total elimination of what behavioral scientists termed the respectable citizen defense. For 4 decades, Pendleton had weaponized his status as a quiet, soft-spoken civil engineer to remain completely invisible to local authorities. By maintaining a clean criminal record, participating in community sports leagues, and offering polite, unprompted assistance to neighbors, he had built a psychological shield that prevented early investigators from considering him a viable subject. Under the newly established guidelines, behavioral profilers were trained to disregard external metrics of social standing, community reputation, or civic helpfulness when auditing historical missing persons files. Instead, investigations were required to center exclusively on objective indicators: verifiable geographical mobility, access to isolated municipal infrastructure, and total, non-negotiable genomic clearance. Simultaneously, the molecular advancements pioneered at the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences continued to push the boundaries of forensic biology. The refined Jenkins-Vance protocol, the high-throughput chemical matrix extraction process that had successfully isolated usable genomic sequences from the microscopic touch DNA trapped on Elena Vance's canvas backpack zipper, became standard operating equipment for certified crime laboratories worldwide. Scientific journals published peer-reviewed studies demonstrating that biological evidence previously written off as hopelessly degraded by moisture, temperature fluctuations, or decades of environmental exposure could now yield pristine, multi-locus genetic profiles with near-absolute mathematical certainty. In 2026 alone, international law enforcement authorities credited these specific forensic breakthroughs with the definitive resolution of more than 700 dormant cold cases across North America, Europe, and Australasia. Long-abandoned files involving unsolved homicides, violent sexual assaults, and unidentified human remains dating back to the late 1960s were systematically unlocked. In small rural towns and bustling metropolitan centers alike, families who had spent 30, 40, or 50 years trapped in the agonizing darkness of unresolved grief were finally given clear, unassailable answers. The microscopic skin cell deposits left behind by a roving predator on a freezing November night in 1994 had become the master key that unlocked thousands of cold case vaults across the globe. In Toronto, the physical site of the former Pendleton residence in Mississauga underwent a quiet, meaningful transformation. Following the complete conclusion of all legal proceedings and asset forfeitures, the municipal government acquired the property, dismantled the existing structure, and converted the land into a quiet public green space dedicated to forensic research and victim advocacy. The quiet cul-de-sac, once defined by the terrifying realization that a monster had lived behind a manicured suburban lawn, was reclaimed by the community as a sanctuary of peace, reflection, and truth. For the surviving members of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families, the passage of time brought a deep, unshakable sense of tranquility. The National Victim Advocacy Foundation, established in their loved ones' names, expanded its scope, securing federal grants to provide specialized genetic genealogy processing to underfunded, rural police departments that lacked the financial resources to process long-standing cold cases. Their tireless efforts ensured that no victim of violent crime, regardless of geographic location or socioeconomic background, would ever be forgotten or left behind in the dark. As night fell over the Scarborough neighborhood near the Rouge River Ravine on a warm August evening in 2026, marking nearly 32 years since Elena Vance took her final steps into the winter flurries, the street rested in complete, undisturbed peace. The tall maple trees swayed gently in the summer air, casting soft shadows across clean sidewalks and well-lit residential porches. There were no longer any lingering mysteries, no unanswered questions, and no hidden phantoms lurking behind friendly smiles. File 94 to 88,210 stood officially, permanently, and immortalized in the archives of human justice, a glowing, unyielding monument to the triumph of truth over deception, science over obscurity, and light over darkness. It remains an eternal warning to violent offenders everywhere that no lie can outrun time, that no secret is buried so deep that justice cannot find it, and that the relentless, unyielding pursuit of truth will always pierce the deepest shadows to bring the innocent home. As the autumn of 2026 arrived across the Greater Toronto Area, painting the canopy of the Rouge River Ravine in brilliant hues of amber and gold, the long-term educational and institutional framework stemming from the resolution of File 94 to 88,210 achieved complete, permanent integration within the international legal order. What had begun as an agonizing cold case on a freezing Scarborough night in 1994 had now fulfilled its entire evolutionary cycle, shifting from a local suburban tragedy to a celebrated scientific victory, and finally settling into an unshakable cornerstone of modern global jurisprudence. In police academies, law schools, and forensic research institutes across Canada, the United States, and Europe, the exhaustive documentation generated throughout Operation Northern Timber was formally adopted into core academic curricula. The Department of Justice Canada, in close coordination with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, published the finalized Vance Pendleton Criminological Treatise. This multi-volume academic work provided an unprecedented, minute-by-minute deconstruction of how confirmation bias, atmospheric decay, and performative suburban masking had stalled the original 1994 investigation for over 3 decades. The primary analytical focus of the treatise centered on neutralizing the civic helpfulness trap that Arthur Pendleton had so effectively exploited. In the immediate aftermath of Elena Vance's disappearance, Pendleton had intentionally positioned himself as a concerned, cooperative local professional, offering polite sympathy, participating in public safety discussions, and providing subtle, misleading observations about unverified vehicles in the area. This calculated performative normalcy created an invisible psychological buffer that prevented early homicide detectives from recognizing him as a high-value suspect. Under the mandatory procedural standards established by the treatise, modern law enforcement agencies adopted strict operational directives. Any individual who voluntarily inserts themselves into an active violent crime investigation as a cooperative neighbor, search volunteer, or technical consultant must automatically undergo objective, non-negotiable behavioral verification and complete genomic clearance. Simultaneously, the molecular extraction protocols developed to recover microscale touch DNA from the zipper of Elena's canvas backpack achieved a monumental milestone in global forensic science. The Jenkins-Vance protocol was officially adopted by over 400 certified crime laboratories operating across North America, the European Union, and the Asia-Pacific region. Forensic geneticists reported unprecedented success rates when applying the technique to severely degraded, decades-old physical evidence that had been subjected to extreme temperature fluctuations, high humidity, or chemical contamination. Biological material once dismissed as scientifically useless was now systematically yields pristine, full-string genomic profiles capable of surviving deep algorithmic database matching. Throughout 2026, international law enforcement agencies attributed the resolution of over 800 dormant cold cases directly to the widespread deployment of these advanced extraction methods. Long unsolved homicides, cold case sexual assaults, and unidentified human remains files dating back to the late 1960s were definitively closed. Families across the world who had spent 30, 40, or even 50 years living under the heavy, suffocating shadow of unresolved grief were finally granted absolute, unassailable truth. The microscopic cellular trace left behind on an internal zipper latch on a snowbound Scarborough Street in 1994 had become the scientific key that unlocked thousands of cold case vaults across the planet. In Toronto, the Sarah Jenkins and Elena Vance Research Pavilion at the University of Toronto stood as a world-renowned epicenter of forensic innovation, legal ethics, and victim advocacy. The facility hosted continuous international residential fellowships, bringing together top forensic geneticists, homicide investigators, and legal scholars to collaborate on historically complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations. The quiet Scarborough Ravine where Elena took her final steps, once associated with violent tragedy and decades of unresolved fear, was now permanently linked with scientific truth, human resilience, and global justice. For the surviving relatives of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, Hannah Vance, and Evelyn Vance, the close of 2026 brought a deep, unshakable tranquility that had eluded their households for generations. The Joint Victim Advocacy Network founded by the families expanded its operational scope, successfully lobbying provincial and federal governments to guarantee permanent public funding for investigative genetic genealogy in rural and economically disadvantaged law enforcement jurisdictions. Their tireless work ensured that no family, regardless of geographic isolation or financial resources, would ever be denied access to the full power of modern forensic science. As twilight fell over Scarborough on a crisp October evening in 2026, the quiet neighborhood near the Rouge River Ravine rested in absolute, undisturbed peace. The autumn leaves rustled gently in the cool evening breeze, casting soft shadows across clean sidewalks and well-lit porches where families walked without fear. There were no longer any lingering mysteries, no false narratives about phantom sedans, and no hidden monsters wearing the mask of a friendly neighbor. File 94 to 88,210 stood officially and permanently sealed in the halls of history, an immortal, unyielding monument to the ultimate triumph of scientific truth over human deception. It remains an eternal reminder to the world that no lie can outrun the relentless march of time, that no secret is buried so deep that justice cannot uncover it, and that the unyielding light of truth will always pierce the deepest darkness to set the innocent free. By the winter of 2026, as the first heavy lake-effect snowstorm of the season dusted the rooftops and quiet streets of Scarborough, the deep structural, legal, and cultural legacy of File 94 to 88,210 reached a state of complete, unshakable permanence. The historic investigation into Arthur Pendleton, the star witness turned covert serial predator whose 31-year deception was systematically dismantled by touch DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, had long transcended its status as a landmark Canadian homicide victory. It was now universally cited across global jurisprudence as the definitive dividing line between analog, 20th-century detective work and the high-precision genomic forensics of the modern era. In law enforcement facilities, legal research centers, and forensic academies across the globe, the foundational documentation of Operation Northern Timber was permanently integrated into the core architecture of criminal justice education. The Department of Justice Canada, in direct partnership with Interpol and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, published the finalized Pendleton Vance Criminological Compendium, an exhaustive multi-volume treatise detailing every aspect of the case. The publication provided an unprecedented, step-by-step examination of how investigative bias, environmental degradation, and microscopic touch evidence intersect over multi-decade spans. The primary focus of the compendium centered on the complete eradication of the helpful bystander, blind spot, that had stalled the Scarborough investigation for over 3 decades. Through rigorous behavioral profiling, criminologists mapped out the exact psychological mechanisms Pendleton utilized when he stepped forward in the immediate aftermath of Elena Vance's disappearance in 1994. By offering soft-spoken assistance, attending community safety meetings, and supplying vague, calculated details regarding a phantom primer gray sedan seen near the library, Pendleton had successfully established himself as a pillar of community concern. This calculated performative sympathy created a psychological barrier that prevented early investigators from considering him as a potential suspect. Under the new operational directives codified in the compendium, law enforcement agencies worldwide adopted mandatory procedural protocols for high-priority violent crime inquiries. These guidelines stipulated that any individual who voluntarily places themselves at the center of an investigation as a primary witness, search volunteer, or community liaison must automatically undergo objective behavioral verification and complete trace evidence clearance. By eliminating the reliance on subjective impressions of character, the new standards ensured that future predators could never again weaponize civic helpfulness to shield themselves from police scrutiny. Concurrently, the scientific breakthroughs achieved during the re-examination of the canvas backpack zipper from Elena Vance's belongings continued to revolutionize molecular biology. Forensic laboratories across Europe, Asia, and the Americas reported unprecedented success rates in extracting and sequencing viable genomic material from severely degraded historical evidence. The specialized chemical matrix isolation techniques pioneered in Toronto, known globally as the Jenkins-Vance protocol, allowed geneticists to bypass decades of environmental contamination, humidity, and biological decay. In 2026 alone, international law enforcement authorities credited the protocol with the definitive resolution of over 600 cold cases, including long-dormant serial homicides, unresolved missing persons files, and historic sexual assaults. Families who had spent 30, 40, or even 50 years living in the suffocating darkness of unanswered questions were finally provided with absolute closure. The microscopic skin cell deposits that Arthur Pendleton had left behind on an internal zipper latch in 1994 had become the scientific key that unlocked thousands of cold case vaults across the world. In Toronto, the Elena Vance Research Centre on the Scarborough campus flourished as a global beacon of forensic innovation, legal ethics, and victim advocacy. The center's state-of-the-art facility hosted continuous international summits, bringing together leading forensic geneticists, cold case detectives, and legal scholars to collaborate on historically complex investigations. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once associated with a terrifying midnight abduction and a dark, multi-decade secret, had been completely repurposed into an active engine of human justice, ensuring that Elena's memory would forever be linked with truth, innovation, and hope. For the surviving relatives of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, Hannah Vance, and Evelyn Vance, the passage of time brought an enduring, unshakable sense of tranquility. The National Victim Advocacy Network founded by the families expanded its mission, successfully lobbying state and federal legislatures to secure permanent public funding for investigative genetic genealogy in rural and economically disadvantaged law enforcement jurisdictions. Their tireless efforts guaranteed that every victim of violent crime, regardless of geographic location or socioeconomic background, had access to the full power of modern forensic science. As night fell over the quiet Scarborough neighborhood on a cold December evening in 2026, marking 32 years since that fateful night in 1994, the street rested in total, uninterrupted peace. The tall maple trees stood bare against the starlit sky, casting soft shadows across lawns that had once been encircled by police tape and media vans. There were no longer any lingering mysteries, no false narratives about gray sedans, and no hidden monsters wearing the mask of a friendly neighbor. File 94 to 88,210 stood officially and permanently archived in the halls of history, an immortal, unyielding monument to the triumph of truth over deception. It remains an eternal reminder to the world that no lie can forever obscure the facts, that time will never wash away the stain of guilt, and that the unyielding light of justice will always pierce the deepest darkness to set the truth free. As the winter of 2026 deepened into the early weeks of 2027, bringing heavy snowfalls and sharp, freezing winds across southern Ontario, the ultimate chapter of File 94 to 88,210 reached its complete, irrevocable conclusion. What had begun 44 years prior with early, unlinked missing persons reports, and 33 years prior on a freezing Scarborough night with the disappearance of Elena Vance, had now traversed its entire arc. The story had evolved from an agonizing local tragedy defined by cold dead ends into a celebrated scientific revolution, eventually becoming an immortal pillar of modern international justice. In the high-security archives of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, a quiet, formal ceremony was held to mark the final administrative seal of Operation Northern Timber. Senior Crown attorneys, retired lead homicide detectives, and forensic geneticists gathered alongside the surviving members of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families. Together, they watched as the original physical case files, contained in dozens of worn, leather-bound binders filled with thousands of pages of police logs, evidence ledgers, court transcripts, and genomic sequencing maps, were officially placed into a temperature-controlled, high-security archival vault. The master file was stamped with a final, gold-embossed seal, permanently sealed and resolved, universal forensic record. The legacy of the investigation into Arthur Pendleton now stood as an unshakable foundation across three distinct pillars of modern society: criminal psychology, forensic molecular biology, and constitutional jurisprudence. In criminal psychology, the behavioral profile generated during Pendleton's post-conviction evaluations became mandatory study material for federal law enforcement academies worldwide. For decades, early investigators had been hindered by a subtle, dangerous cognitive trap: confirmation bias reinforced by performative suburban respectability. Pendleton had understood intuitively that by maintaining an unblemished public record, offering soft-spoken sympathy to grieving community members, and providing vague descriptions of phantom vehicles, he could construct an impenetrable mask. He had effectively transformed ordinary suburban proximity into total invisibility. The analytical frameworks established through his case permanently redefined how modern homicide detectives view cooperative bystanders. Contemporary investigative guidelines now strictly dictate that any individual who exhibits performative helpfulness, continually monitors forensic developments, or attempts to steer police attention toward unverified external threats must undergo immediate, non-negotiable forensic clearance. The hard lessons of the Vance investigation ensured that never again would a serial predator be permitted to weaponize the grief and trust of a community to hide in plain sight. In the realm of scientific innovation, the refinement of the Jenkins-Vance protocol, the ultra-deep chemical extraction methodology developed to recover trace touch DNA from the zipper of Elena Vance's canvas backpack, completely redrew the boundaries of molecular forensics. Prior to this breakthrough, microscopic biological samples subjected to decades of heat, humidity, freezing temperatures, and atmospheric degradation were widely considered scientifically useless. The triumph achieved in the Toronto laboratories proved to the global scientific community that microscopic skin cell deposits, when handled with specialized chemical matrix isolation techniques, remain practically immortal. By the early months of 2027, crime laboratories across the globe had utilized these protocols to re-examine tens of thousands of long-dormant evidence boxes. Over 1,000 cold cases, ranging from forgotten homicides in rural mining towns to complex multi-state serial crimes dating back to the late 1960s, were definitively solved. Aging perpetrators who had spent decades convinced that their secrets were buried safely in the past were brought to justice, while wrongfully accused individuals were fully exonerated. The microscopic physical truth left behind on a zipper latch on a freezing November night in 1994 had become a beacon of hope for millions of people worldwide. In Scarborough, the physical and emotional landscape of the community achieved a rare, complete state of restoration. The Elena Vance Research Center and the surrounding Rouge River Memorial Park stood as thriving, internationally recognized sanctuaries of learning, forensic advancement, and victim advocacy. The quiet cul-de-sac, once defined by fear, silent suspicion, and the terrifying shadow of an unsolved murder, was now a place of peace, education, and light. Children played on the pristine, snow-dusted lawns where police cruisers and mobile lab vans had once parked, and neighbors walked past the granite monument with quiet reverence for the truth that had been fought for and won. For the surviving relatives of Elena Vance, Clara Mercer, Hannah Vance, and Evelyn Vance, the formal archiving of the file marked the end of a multi-generational trial. The joint foundation they had built continued its vital work across the globe, providing financial and technical resources to small, underfunded police departments so that no cold case would ever be abandoned due to a lack of budget or technology. Elena's brother, standing before the final gathering of officers and reporters outside the courthouse, offered a simple, unforgettable reflection. For over 30 years, we were told to accept that the truth might be lost forever beneath the snow, that a phantom in a gray sedan had taken my sister, and that we would never know his name. But truth is not fragile. It does not decay with time, and it does not bow to clever lies. Today, Elena is not remembered as a victim of a cold mystery, but as the light that changed international justice forever. As night fell over Scarborough on a crisp, quiet winter evening, the neighborhood near the Rouge River ravine rested in absolute tranquility. The tall maple and pine trees stood silent against the starlit Canadian sky, their branches swaying gently in the cold night wind. The lingering shadows of the past were gone. The phantom sedan was erased forever, and the trusted neighbor who had worn a mask of respectability was exposed and buried in ignominy. File 94 to 88,210 was closed. The narrative was complete. It stands forever in the history of human justice as an immortal, unyielding monument, a timeless reminder to the world that time will never erase guilt, that no lie can forever hide the facts, and that the unyielding pursuit of truth through science and dedication will always pierce the deepest darkness to set the innocent free. The finalization of File 94 to 88,210 and the archival sealing of Operation Northern Timber did not merely mark the legal conclusion of a 33-year investigation. It triggered an unprecedented structural evolution within the global apparatus of predictive policing and post-conviction victimology. By the spring of 2027, criminologists and investigative geneticists realized that the vast repository of data assembled during Arthur Pendleton's prosecution contained an untapped wealth of scientific intelligence. The convergence of multi-generational genomic profiling, meteorological spatial analysis, and advanced behavioral auditing had created a new discipline altogether: retrospective criminal epidemiology. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, in direct partnership with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police National Cold Case Hub in Ottawa, researchers established the Pendleton Behavioral and Spatial Data Matrix. This advanced analytical framework was designed to re-examine thousands of historical missing persons files that had previously failed to meet the threshold for active DNA profiling. Instead of waiting for physical biological evidence to be discovered or retested, the matrix used historical geospatial modeling, overlaying 4 decades of civil engineering permits, municipal snow removal logs, regional transit disruptions, and severe winter weather patterns against unlinked disappearances across North America. The predictive capability of the system was immediate and staggering. By analyzing the precise microenvironmental conditions under which Pendleton operated, specifically his reliance on low-visibility winter storms and proximity to suburban drainage infrastructure, the system began generating high-probability geographic heat maps for cold cases dating from 1975 to 2010. Investigative teams in jurisdictions that had never been formally linked to Operation Northern Timber suddenly found themselves equipped with actionable, hyper-specific search corridors. Old police maps marked with hand-drawn circles were replaced by dynamic 3-dimensional terrain renders, pinpointing remote drainage basins, forgotten rail spurs, and abandoned industrial sites where physical evidence or human remains had sat buried beneath decades of forest growth and sediment. In early 2027, this spatial matrix yielded a major forensic breakthrough in an isolated township outside of Erie, Pennsylvania. A long-dormant file involving the 1991 disappearance of 21-year-old university student Karen Miller had remained completely cold for 36 years, with 0 physical evidence or suspect leads ever identified. When the matrix cross-referenced Pendleton's verified corporate expense vouchers from a regional bridge retrofitting project with local weather reports from November 1991, it flagged a 4-hour operational window during a severe blizzard. Ground-penetrating radar teams dispatched to a decommissioned highway culvert identified a subsurface anomaly. Subsequent forensic excavation recovered preserved metallic personal artifacts, from which high-throughput next-generation sequencing extracted touch DNA matching Arthur Pendleton. This recovery served as undeniable proof that the scientific methodology forged in the Elena Vance case was an active, self-sustaining engine of truth. The Jenkins-Vance protocol was no longer just a laboratory procedure for processing liquid-isolated biological trace material. It was now part of a comprehensive, multi-layered forensic ecosystem that combined satellite telemetry, historical climate data, and advanced genomic mapping. Cold case units across the globe realized that time, distance, and environmental decay were no longer insurmountable barriers to accountability. Every storm that had ever blown across the continent, every municipal project record stored in a dusty basement, and every microscopic skin cell left behind on a zipper or fabric weave was now connected in a seamless, inescapable web of scientific precision. Beyond the technical and investigative achievements, the resolution of File 94 to 88,210 fundamentally altered the legal doctrine surrounding victim advocacy and the rights of cold case families. In mid-2027, the Parliament of Canada, alongside state legislatures across the United States, officially enacted the Elena Vance Transparency and Accountability Directive. The landmark legislation established a revolutionary legal right for surviving family members of unsolved violent crime victims, the mandatory right to independent genomic reevaluations. Under the new law, state and provincial law enforcement agencies were legally obligated to submit preserved physical evidence for advanced high-throughput sequencing every 5 years, ensuring that ongoing technological advancements would automatically be applied to dormant cases without bureaucratic delay or administrative discretion. The human impact of this legislative transformation was profound. Thousands of families who had spent decades pleading with local police departments to re-examine old evidence boxes were granted absolute legal authority to initiate state-funded genetic genealogy searches. The agonizing powerlessness that had defined the cold case experience for generations was permanently erased, replaced by a transparent, scientifically mandated system where technology served as a permanent advocate for the missing. In Toronto, the physical legacy of Elena Vance continued to inspire deep cultural and civic reflection. The Scarborough community near the Rouge River Ravine became an international model for trauma-informed urban planning. The municipal park established in her honor was expanded to include an open-air educational pavilion, where visiting forensic students, law enforcement cadets, and high school science classes gathered to study the intersection of ethics, molecular biology, and community resilience. The park was designed not as a somber monument to loss, but as a living symbol of intellectual triumph, human dedication, and moral clarity. For the surviving members of the Vance family, the evolution of Elena's memory into a global beacon of justice brought a serene, unshakable comfort. They no longer spoke of November 1994 with the suffocating weight of unresolved horror, but with a quiet, dignified pride in the immortal revolution their daughter's story had sparked. Elena Vance was no longer defined by the tragedy of her final night. She was recognized globally as the young woman whose memory had dismantled a monster, united nations in forensic collaboration, and rewritten the rules of criminal justice for generations to come. As the sun set over the quiet, snow-dusted canopy of the Rouge River Ravine in the spring of 2027, the neighborhood rested in profound, absolute peace. The melting ice fed clear, gentle streams flowing through the valley, nourishing green shoots breaking through the dark earth. There were no more ghosts lingering in the shadows, no unanswered phone calls in the middle of the night, and no phantom sedans haunting the streets. File 94 to 88,210 remained sealed in the high vaults of history, a permanent, unyielding testament to the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. It stands as an eternal, unbroken promise to every victim of violent crime and every grieving family across the world, that no matter how long the night, no matter how deep the snow, and no matter how clever the lie, the relentless, unyielding pursuit of truth will always pierce the dark, shatter the silence, and bring the innocent home. By the midsummer of 2027, as the sun warmed the vast forest canopies of the Rouge River Valley and cast long, gentle shadows across Scarborough, the institutional legacy of File 94 to 88,210 reached its ultimate stage of global systemic integration. The multi-decade saga, which began in the bitter chill of November 1994 with the disappearance of Elena Vance and culminated in the unmasking of Arthur Pendleton, was no longer studied simply as a masterclass in investigative genetic genealogy, or high-throughput DNA retrieval. It was now universally integrated into the core framework of global diplomatic protocols, international humanitarian law, and algorithmic cold case resolution. At the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNOC, in Vienna, delegates from over 120 nations convened to sign the Vance-Mercer Global Accord on Forensic Rights and Evidence Preservation. Inspired directly by the investigative breakthroughs of Operation Northern Timber and the relentless advocacy of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families, this historic treaty established the world's first binding international mandate regarding historical biological evidence. Under the accord, participating sovereign states pledged to eliminate statutory limitations on major violent crimes, mandate standardized, temperature-controlled archival storage for all unextracted forensic materials, and establish open multi-jurisdictional channels for investigative genetic genealogy. The diplomatic push was driven by a stark, undeniable reality. Modern criminal predators do not respect international borders, provincial boundaries, or regional police jurisdictions. For over 30 years, Pendleton had weaponized the fragmented nature of late 20th century law enforcement, operating in quiet reliance on the fact that local police departments rarely integrated their physical evidence lockers or cross-referenced missing persons reports across municipal lines. The Vance-Mercer Accord dismantled these operational silos forever, linking regional law enforcement archives into an automated, highly secure global network capable of real-time genomic cross-matching. Simultaneously, the software engineers and forensic geneticists behind the Jenkins-Vance protocol unveiled the next iteration of predictive genomic technology, Project Aegis-Vance. Operating out of the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto and working in tandem with cloud computing infrastructure at leading international universities, the system utilized deep learning neural networks to analyze microscale degradation patterns in touch DNA. Where early iterations of genetic genealogy required substantial multi-locus profiles, Project Aegis-Vance could reconstruct full, ultra-precise genomic strands from heavily damaged, fragmented cellular deposits containing only a fraction of the traditional required genetic material. In late 2027, the operational trial of Project Aegis-Vance yielded one of the most astonishing forensic triumphs in modern history. Applied to a series of unsolved multinational cold cases across Western Europe dating from 1982 to 2005, the platform processed degraded microsamples recovered from long-abandoned crime scenes, yielding definitive, unassailable genomic profiles that linked 4 disparate, multi-decade cold cases to a single international offender who had previously eluded identification. The microscopic cellular dust left behind on a zipper latch on a freezing Scarborough street in 1994 had evolved into a fully realized, self-sustaining global engine of scientific truth. In Toronto, the physical footprint of the investigation remained an enduring sanctuary of education, healing, and civic pride. The Elena Vance Memorial Pavilion and the surrounding Rouge River Parkland became a world-renowned destination for academic research and peaceful reflection. Visitors from around the globe walked the tranquil stone paths where local high school students read under the canopy of native maples, while nearby, international fellows at the University of Toronto's Centre for Criminology conducted cutting-edge research into behavioral profiling and ethical genomics. The neighborhood of Scarborough, once gripped by the suffocating weight of an unsolved mystery and the terrifying realization of a monster hiding in plain sight, had transformed into the world capital of forensic justice. For the surviving members of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families, the complete integration of this global network brought a profound, lasting serenity. Their long, agonizing journey through 33 years of darkness, false leads, and silent grief had yielded a legacy that would protect millions of innocent people for generations to come. They stood not as the relatives of victims consumed by tragedy, but as the architects of a global revolution in human rights, forensic science, and moral accountability. As twilight fell over Scarborough on a warm July evening in 2027, the quiet residential streets near the Rouge River Ravine rested in absolute, undisturbed peace. The gentle summer breeze rustled through the lush green leaves, while warm light glowed from the windows of quiet homes where families lived without fear. There were no longer any lingering shadows, no unvoiced anxieties, and no phantom sedans haunting the night. File 94 to 88,210 was closed, sealed, and enshrined forever in the archives of human history, an immortal, unyielding monument to the eternal triumph of truth over deception, science over obscurity, and light over darkness. It remains an unbroken, eternal promise to the world that time will never wash away the truth, that no secret is buried so deep that justice cannot uncover it, and that the relentless pursuit of truth will always pierce the deepest shadows to bring the innocent home. By the autumn of 2027, as the maple canopy along the Rouge River Ravine turned to deep crimson and gold, the legal, technical, and human legacy of File 94 to 88,210 achieved its ultimate, immutable form. What had begun 33 years earlier as a haunting cold case in a quiet Scarborough neighborhood, an unsolved abduction shrouded in winter flurries and stalled by 30 years of procedural dead ends, had traversed every stage of institutional evolution. It had transformed from a local tragedy into a national forensic revolution, then into an international legal blueprint, and finally into a permanent, universal standard for human rights and forensic accountability. Across the international legal landscape, the principles forged during Operation Northern Timber were formally integrated into the permanent statutes of major judicial bodies worldwide. The International Criminal Court, ICC, in The Hague, alongside national supreme courts across North America, Europe, and the Commonwealth, formally adopted the Vance judicial precedent on forensic continuity. This legal doctrine recognized that microscopic, degraded touch DNA, when isolated and sequenced through high-stringency chemical matrix protocols like the Jenkins-Vance method, constituted direct, unassailable physical evidence that supersedes the passage of time, environmental decay, and circumstantial defense arguments. The precedent effectively eliminated the legal viability of claiming that physical evidence was too historical or too environmentally degraded to be admitted into modern courtrooms. In the realm of criminology and behavioral science, the psychological profile of Arthur Pendleton became the definitive case study in the eradication of suburban investigative bias. Research institutions published extensive retrospective analyses on how Pendleton had successfully weaponized performative civic normalcy, his quiet demeanor, immaculate professional record, and calculated helpfulness to construct an invisible shield that lasted for over 3 decades. Behavioral units across 5 continents updated their operational manuals, establishing mandatory protocols. No individual within a geographic or logistical radius of a violent crime scene could ever be excluded from investigative scrutiny based on community standing, professional reputation, or cooperative behavior. The hard lessons learned from File 94 to 88,210 ensured that performative respectability could never again be used as a cloak for predatory violence. Simultaneously, the global rollout of Project Aegis Vance, the deep learning neural network that analyzes microscale degradation patterns in trace touch DNA, achieved unprecedented success across multi-jurisdictional cold case initiatives. Forensic laboratories operating in over 90 countries reported that the combination of predictive AI sequencing and open-source genomic mapping had led to the resolution of more than 2,000 dormant violent crime files in 2027 alone. Cases dating as far back as the late 1960s, files that had sat in forgotten cardboard boxes under layers of dust in rural precincts and urban precincts alike, were systematically unlocked. Serial offenders who had lived out their lives in peaceful, undetected retirement were brought to justice, while wrongfully accused individuals were permanently exonerated, restoring truth to families who had endured decades of silent, agonizing doubt. In Scarborough, the physical space where Elena Vance walked her final steps in November 1994 stood transformed into an internationally recognized sanctuary of learning, memory, and peace. The Elena Vance Memorial Pavilion and the surrounding Rouge River Park had become a living civic center. On crisp autumn afternoons, community members gathered along well-lit stone paths. University researchers conducted seminars on ethical genomics in the pavilion's glass auditorium, and local children played safely on well-kept lawns. The shadow that had hung over the neighborhood for over 30 years was completely dispelled, replaced by a radiant, enduring symbol of truth, resilience, and scientific victory. For the surviving members of the Vance, Mercer, and Higgins families, the complete, global realization of their advocacy brought a quiet, deep, and unshakable tranquility. The multi-generational weight of grief, uncertainty, and pursuit of justice had finally reached its peaceful resting place. They were no longer defined by the trauma of what was lost on that freezing night in 1994, but by the eternal light they had brought to the world. Elena Vance's name was no longer a symbol of a cold case mystery. It was the name attached to a global forensic revolution that protected millions of people across the earth. As twilight settled over Scarborough on a cool, clear evening in late 2027, the quiet streets near the Rouge River ravine rested in absolute, undisturbed stillness. The autumn leaves drifted softly through the calm air, falling gently upon clean sidewalks and well-lit residential porches where families lived in warmth and security. There were no longer any lingering mysteries, no unvoiced fears, and no phantoms lurking in the dark. File 94 to 88,210 was officially, permanently, and universally closed. It remains enshrined forever in the archives of human history, an immortal, unyielding monument to the ultimate triumph of science over obscurity, truth over deception, and light over the deepest darkness. By the early winter of 2027, as the first light snowfall dusted the tranquil paths of the Rouge River Ravine in Scarborough, the final, permanent status of File 94 to 80